Hello, I'm Steve Resnikoff, and I'm the director of the DePaul University College of Law Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies, and I'm also a professor of the College of Law. I want to thank you all for coming. This program is entitled Anti-Semitic Influences of DEI Programs, Can They Be Corrected? It's sponsored by our center, and it's co-sponsored by the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. I appreciate very much that you come. I wanted to thank everybody who registered in advance, and to those who did register in advance, I sent you a number of emails with information about the program, including links to many important articles and discussions, even to a video of one of our speakers. If you haven't gotten that link, if you didn't get that link, please send me an email to sresnico, R-E-S-N-I-C-O, @depaul.edu, and I can be happy to send it to you again. This program is free, but we do have a request that you seriously consider providing a donation, a tax-deductible donation to our scholarship fund. The scholarship fund is to bring students whose ideas and interests dovetail with ours to the DePaul College of Law. We can only be effective at our mission if we have students who are active and interested, and we need to attract them. And the way to do it is through the scholarship fund. Again, in the emails that I sent you a link to which you can make a direct donation, and I'll be happy to send that link to you again also if you would be nice enough to let me know you would like it. This is a CLE program. Illinois General CLE has been approved. We have actually applied for, but won't know for another 2 weeks whether we will be authorized to grant Illinois diversity CLE credit. Those of you who want CLE have to use the link that I sent. And again, if you didn't get that link, send me an email and I'll send it out to you again to complete the survey, the evaluation of this program at the end of the program. During the program, we have 5 speakers. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. That's where you should post the questions. We may not have much time for questions because even though it's a 3-hour program, we have a 3-hour and 15-minute program. We have 5 excellent speakers, but we'll try. And that you can share ideas with each other through the chat as well. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, are extremely important human rights ideals, and educational programming is an essential element in the effort to achieve them. And in fact, on campus and in the workplace, there has been a dramatic and pervasive rise in DEI personnel and programming. Yet at the same time that ever-increasing resources are devoted to DEI, there has been an unprecedented explosion in virulent, hateful antisemitism. This program examines whether these two developments are interrelated. It explores whether factors such as bias in DEI personnel, programs, and teachings contribute to antisemitism. They actually, 1, deny the tragic historical persecution of Jews. They falsely label all Jews as merely part of the undeservedly privileged white, accusing them of being responsible for systemic racism and for promoting white supremacy. They ignore the Jewish experience and the existential role that the land of Israel plays in Jewish identity, and they promote all sorts of classical anti-Semitic tropes. There's a number of overlapping and interrelated factors that contribute to this phenomenon, and I will mention just 3. The first factor is the fundamental ignorance about the Jewish experience. And I use the word ignorance in its basic sense, not as an insulting term, but as just an accurate term, that the people are just ignorant of Jewish history. Not just about how Jews were butchered during and after the Crusades, not just about how Jews were continuously persecuted throughout European history, being subjected to humiliation, impoverishment, torture, and death, and not just about the ineffable horrors of the Holocaust, but also ignorance of the history of Jews in this country, in America. It's a long history of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, educational discrimination. One of our speakers is a professor at the medical school at Stanford. Stanford just recently admitted how it discriminated against Jews, but that's just one of many, many examples. social discrimination at beaches, parks, hotels, restaurants, clubs, and myriads of other facilities that excluded Jews, often brazenly and insultingly. Jews were defamed as Christ killers until the 1960s. That was the official Christian or official Catholic policy. And I remember being told that when I was a child. Indeed, not just in Europe, but even in the United States, Jews were not even considered white. They were regarded as a separate race, a separate inferior race. In fact, in the United States, the 19th century Civil Rights Act, which prescribed racial discrimination and not religious discrimination, was found by the United States Supreme Court to prohibit anti-Semitic discrimination. Why? Because the Supreme Court held that the Congress that enacted that law had regarded Jews as a separate race. So racial discrimination was Jewish discrimination. Jewish discrimination was racial discrimination. Then there's ignorance about the important, really inextricable link between Jews and Zionism. Despite contrary statements by a disproportionately loud, but actually quite small number of token Jews who criticize Zionism, the overwhelming percentage of Jews, maybe 80% or higher, are enthusiastic Zionists, whether as a matter of religion, ethnicity, or nationalism. While honest, legitimate criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitic, the delegitimization and demonization of Israel and Israelis is anti-Semitic. And so is the use of double standards when evaluating alleged Israeli practices or policies. And then there's ignorance about the notion of white passing. First, many people in DEI programs, and you'll hear that they express this at Stanford as well, held that Jews aren't really deserving of particular attention in DEI programs because they can pass as white. Well, first, a full 10% of Jews in the United States identify as people of color. They include Jews from Ethiopia, from the Middle East, from South America, and elsewhere. And so it's a myth to say that Jews are of one race. And second, many Jews, for religious reasons or for other reasons, wear distinctive garb, such as a kippah, like the one I'm wearing, or a Star of David necklace that many others wear. The ability to pass for white is essentially the ability to deny one's Jewish identity. It's not a solution. DEI is supposed to include people for who they are, not to make them camouflage themselves and deny themselves and incur that kind of emotional and psychological tension. A second factor is far more sinister, of course. It's this influence of actual Jew hatred, whether religiously or politically based. Such haters may want to abuse DEI programming to help influence or to help to inflame similar Jewish hatred in others. And there's at least a third factor. Some people may not hate Jews. They simply want to utilize DEI resources purportedly appropriated to promote understanding and improved relations among all peoples. They want to help only some people, not because they hate Jews, but because for whatever reason, they simply care more about others. This bias, of course, makes them all the more susceptible to believing anti-Semitic tropes and propaganda, because they like to legitimize in their own minds the fact that they are shortchanging Judaism and Jews and relegating them to the back. The upshot is that some DEI programs are guilty of simply ignoring the victimization of Jews, while others actively participate in the victimization. Before we turn to the first speaker, let me just mention a couple of examples of problems with DEI programming. So, for example, Stop Antisemitism is a group national group that reviewed 24 major colleges and universities and their DEI programs. And they found that only 2 of them had any specific programming or materials regarding anti-Semitism. At Yale University, a diversity trainer that the Yale Law Journal brought to campus and she told her audience that the FBI inflated anti-Semitism statistics. She provided no evidence. She just claimed that they inflated anti-Semitism statistics. When she was asked why her presentation had not mentioned anti-Semitism, she said, well, she didn't have to discuss it because at least some blacks were Jews, which of course doesn't make much sense as explaining why she shouldn't mention the separate issue of anti-Semitism. At USC in 2021, a student senator for diversity, equity, and inclusion posted numerous anti-Semitic statements on Twitter and other social media. Among the messages were, "I want to kill every MFing Zionist," and "death to Israel and to its bitch, the United States." An open letter to the leadership of USC, signed by a large number of undergraduate faculty, stated in part, quote, "We, the undersigned faculty of USC, we, the undersigned faculty, wish to register our dismay about ongoing open expressions of anti-Semitism and Zionophobia on our campus that go unrebuked. The silence of our leadership on this matter is alienating, hurtful, and depressing. It amounts to tacit acceptance of a toxic atmosphere of hatred and hostility," unquote. This is just a snippet from that open letter. At CUNY, the City University of New York, at the Kingsborough Community College branch, in 2021, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission found that its progressive faculty caucus, and its staff union engaged in a pattern of discrimination against observant Jews and supporters of Israel. Nevertheless, when it recently impaneled a 7-person search committee to hire a, quote, diversity officer, unquote, none of those people on the committee were Jewish. The Jewish News Service reports that the president of the college even refused to disclose the names of the members of the committee, of the search committee, to the school's personnel and budget committee that had advisory purview over such hires. Nevertheless, the JNS, the Jewish News Service, reported that one of the 7 members of the committee was someone who had publicly supported the BDS movement, the movement calling for a boycott of, a divestment from, and sanctions on the Jewish state of Israel. Before I introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ronald Albuquerque, let me explain that when we held the program a couple of days ago, we experienced 1 or 2 technological glitches, and we lost the first few minutes of his remarks describing his upbringing. To provide a little context to his presentation, let me state that Dr. Albuquerque has filed a complaint against Stanford University, alleging that he suffered anti-Semitic discrimination over a significant period of time in one of its DEI programs. Another healthcare professional at Stanford joined in the complaint. It's quite a shocking story, and one that he exhibits a great deal of courage in sharing. But before I introduce him, I want to mention one other thing. This is it's actually a bonus, because we have to retape this first introduction as well. And that is that one of the people who attended our program, a social worker, her name is Annette Posner. She shared with me after the program the fact that she in Canada, and along with some similarly trained people in the United States, are campaigning to reveal the fact that its social work programs, and by the way, DEI is an offshoot of social work, but social work schools are no longer, or many of them are no longer, teaching anything about anti-Semitism in their curriculum. This substantially contributes to the problem of the DEI officers ignoring anti-Semitism. Social workers have to be trained in anti-Semitism, and she's working on that and having some success in Canada. And hopefully we'll get more attention, maybe even through this tape, to the problem, so that we can make progress in the United States as well. So now, Dr. Ronald Albuquerque, he's a clinical professor of psychiatry at Stanford University's medical school, and he's the former director of counseling and psychological services at Stanford's Vaden Health Center. After his graduation from the University of Michigan Medical School and his residency there, he joined the faculty at the University of Michigan's Medical School's Department of Psychiatry, where he specialized in anxiety disorders, mental health treatment of university residents, and medical students. And he also ran the Ann Arbor Veterans Administration's Medical Center's Mental Health Clinic. He was the Associate Training Director at the University of Michigan Department of Psychiatry for about 10 years. He's been very involved in organized psychiatry, holding numerous positions within the American Psychiatric Association, Michigan Psychiatric Society, and the Northern California Psychiatric Society. Dr. Albuquerque has presented at a variety of conferences, published 2 books on board review, and has published scientific research in peer-reviewed journals. He continues to serve on the review boards of several journals and publications, and is working on 2 products currently, as well as pursuing many other interests. Now, we're going to switch to Dr. Albuquerque in a minute. Just want to mention to you that we lost, because of some technological problems, we lost a couple of minutes of his introductory comments, which talked about his background, his upbringing, and the fact that he was somewhat sheltered from anti-Semitism as when in his upbringing, in his early years. His experience at Stanford has been very, very troubling, and it's a very big concern, and we are so honored to have him speak with us. Dr. Albuquerque.
So, been mentioning some of my upbringing and kind of insulation from, little did I know, after I had stepped down from the directorship of the counseling program at Stanford, I had actually handed over control to a colleague that I had known for over 30 years. We had been friends in residency, and I was her chief resident for a time. And all of this was soon to change, little to my knowledge, as DEI process began to unfold at Stanford. To me, it's still ironic and hard to wrap my head around all these redefinitions of what inclusion means, what power issues, blame, culpability issues. And I certainly did not expect the problem to show up at the DEI, in a DEI setting, which is supposed to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I certainly didn't expect it to show up at Stanford and at Stanford's counseling program. We, of course, see all of the students on campus from a variety of backgrounds, including Jewish and Israeli students. And so this just came as a complete shock to me. Unfortunately, the DEI program promoted a very discriminatory, hate-promoting agenda that left counselors that were participating in this training, most of whom were not Jewish, left them less able to treat students, which was our primary goal there. And it also shut down the exchange of free ideas and any kind of dissent from the orthodoxy being presented. That this went on at Stanford in, the year 2020 may be hard to believe, and I wouldn't blame you for doubting it. It just doesn't seem possible. And yet, it did happen. So the story begins in November of 2019 when our new director, my colleague, announced that we had been asked to start weekly DEI trainings and that we should all be attending and participating. And the intentions put forth sounded like the usual ones, increasing awareness of other cultures and religions and so on. And so I was expecting, to actually enjoy and learn something from these trainings. The ground rules for participation were the typical ones you would find at a place of higher education: respecting others, taking turns speaking, not personalizing arguments, and so on. And unfortunately, none of these ended up being followed. We used the book White Fragility as a guideline to start the process of DEI training. And one of the recommendations from the book, and then this recommendation was implemented, was to separate out staff into white affinity groups and people of color. And for Jews, they identified us as the people running the DEI group, defined us as belonging in the white affinity group. We were told that we were part of a rich white and powerful group, and therefore should participate with the white affinity group, even though some of us identified as people of color, as Stephen had mentioned. Part of the rationale for this is
so we've lost you again, Doctor. Maybe you could make that switch that you suggested. While we wait for the doctor to reestablish his connection, I just want to mention that there's another mental health care staff member at Stanford who's also joined in the complaint that was filed. And I believe that she's no longer associated with Stanford. And she describes situations where DEI officers made dismissive comments about her ability, since she's a Jewish woman, to relate to the problem that Blacks have, and so on. The materials that are on the Brandeis Center for Human Rights under Law, we sent you a link to that. They go into that in considerable detail. I'm happy to see that the doctor's back with us, and so I will duck out and put him back into the screen.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. I'm so sorry. I switched internet. Hopefully this will take care of the problem, but we were chatting before, Stephen and I was like, this just convinces me how people who are worried the machines are going to take over. It's kind of doesn't seem possible. You know, we can't even get the internet to work. So, okay. So I was mentioning about the separation of our staff into separate groups of people of color and white affinity, and with the idea being that the white affinity group should not tax the people of color to do emotional labor, to do the work of educating the people who identified as white. And so that was the rationale. By the way, there was no Jewish space to, or Jewish group, affinity group. We were just kind of lumped in with the white staff. And of course, the white staff itself was quite a diverse group, but that didn't matter. It's if you looked white or were identified as white, you went into this group. I began to speak up fairly early in the process. And at the first meeting, which took place in February of 2020, where I did speak up, I was unfortunately harassed, and a bunch of people piled on to criticize me for speaking up, including my new boss, who I'd recommended for her position. In fact, it was so bad that one of our psychiatrists actually quit over this display of bullying. In her note, when she left our program, she said it was analogous to watching a principal join in with bullies at a middle school as they tormented one of the students, rather than intervening to stop it. The feedback I got in that meeting was that I was a person of white privilege, even though that was not my personal identification. and that I was co-opting the meeting. I remember even some of the facial expressions from the leaders of the DEI group, like almost like a snarling facial expression and anger towards me because I was contributing to systemic racism. So I learned my lesson, so to speak, and was quiet for a little bit. Continued to attend those meetings for a while. And then in May of 2020, there were a series of incidents, including a Zoom bombing incident with racist, anti-Black, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic symbols, including swastikas. Later in the summer, there were swastikas near the church on campus. When our DEI meeting happened after these events, there was no mention of the swastikas. There was just the mention of how the N-word was used, how nooses were found on campus, and so on, which is, of course, legitimate and should be discussed. So I felt compelled again to raise my hand and say, you know, why was this eliminated? This is also important for us to discuss. And I was told that it was deliberately omitted so as not to distract from a discussion on anti-Black racism. And in fact, my speaking up was even an effort to derail the focus of the DEI committee. We Jews were told that we could hide behind our white identity, which was not an option for Black people in this country. And that, again, Jews were wealthy, powerful, privileged people. During this meeting, one of the leaders of the DEI committee even told me that I don't have her back clinically. Now, this was somebody who was relatively recently hired. She and I had had a few interactions, mostly just saying hello in the hallway. So I had no idea how she had come to this conclusion that I would not support her or back her up in a clinical situation. But I think the message is clear that essentially Jews cannot be trusted. They will essentially stab you in the back if given the chance. At this point, I had to stop attending these DEI meetings. And I began to raise concerns about this to my boss, who, as you recall, had participated in some of the piling on and criticism. My boss's boss, eventually and this took place over a course of a year and a half period, eventually human resources was involved, and it went up to the level of the vice provost for student affairs, which is one level down from the president and provost, which are the most senior officials. So this basically went about as high up as you could go, even because of my connection with the Department of Psychiatry, which is under the medical school jurisdiction. I had notified my chair that this was happening. At this higher level, people professed that they were concerned. An investigation was begun, and subsequently actually even found a lot of evidence in my favor. And yet nothing changed. The DEI meetings continued. The anti-Semitism continued. And so even though Stanford was aware, they did nothing to intervene. Now, from my point of view, I could not imagine if you substituted Black or Latino or another historically disadvantaged group for Jew, that this wouldn't have stopped immediately. And yet this took over a year to get attention, to get things going, and still it didn't stop. One of my colleagues who together we filed the complaint through the Brandeis Center to the EEOC. She was attacked again for being white and privileged when she was just offering to try to support her colleague. This is what she was told: don't support us, you need to go look at your white privilege. At an open house where we're meant to recruit new trainees to our program, we run a training program as part of our clinic. We train residents, we train psychiatry residents, we train pre-doctoral, postdoctoral candidates who are training to become future psychologists. One of the speakers from our clinic equated Jews with white supremacy at this open house. Like, how this even came up is shocking, and yet this was one of the opinions voiced to a prospective group. So I have no idea if any of the people applying were Jewish or supported Jews, in their life, but I couldn't imagine the impact on them. Likewise, there was another colleague had told this group that she runs a social justice training that is anti-Zionist. Not anti anything else, just anti-Zionist. And one of my other colleagues recommended a book that she was reading that was anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. This is, again, all in the context of welcoming prospective trainees to our program. This, of course, had no place there whatsoever, never mind that it was incredibly discriminatory and hateful. We also had the experience, one of our residents that was training with us was Jewish, and he stopped going to his clinical team meetings because of anti-Semitism expressed in that clinical team meeting. Basically, we divide the clinic up into teams and we meet weekly to discuss cases and so on. Again, not a place you would expect to find anti-Semitism, and yet it was strong enough that this resident stopped going. Then things reached a peak where my boss, the colleague who I mentioned earlier, that we were close for over 30 years, we'd known each other, I know her family and so on, and recommended her for the position to replace me. She ended up, we had a discussion about my concerns and my complaints that I had raised, and she basically said this conversation is over and walked out of my office when I was trying to express how I was seeing anti-Semitism in the clinic. I can tell you, I've been in several administrative positions where I've run clinics, including the one I'm talking about. For 9 years, I did that. I never once walked out of a colleague's office saying this conversation is over. I couldn't imagine doing that. Even if I didn't agree with the colleague, I would still listen to them because it's my job to do that. Again, this didn't happen. So it was around this time that we did reach out to the Brandeis Center and got legal consultation because we were not making any headway within the university system, and ended up filing a complaint that is still ongoing to both the EEOC at the federal level and at the state level. And you actually have copies of those complaints in some of the handouts that Stephen provided. So you can look through those. And yes, and those cases are still ongoing. It's an incredibly slow process, as you might imagine, for a federal agency investigating this. We are hopeful of a good outcome, but it remains to be seen. So what lessons can we learn from this particular experience? Stephen, are you letting me know that I should wrap things up?
No, I'm not. I'm just getting ready.
Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, I'm kind of summarizing, and then we can talk a little bit to try to do some answer some questions if there's time. So what are the lessons? I think, as you heard from my description, DEI places are, or DEI committees, DEI programming are potentially and quite often dangerous places for Jews. Quite frankly, they are anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. This, in my mind, is the old anti-Semitism wrapped in a new package. This is how the anti-Semitism continues in our day and age, under the guise of social justice, under the guise of doing good by others, expanding consciousness, awareness of other people suffering, and trying to advocate for improvements in civil rights. Somehow the Jews are left out of the process, and not only left out, but actually actively attacked. DEI programming can be segregating. We thought we had handled this issue decades ago, and yet somehow now it's legitimate to segregate people based on their skin color into their affinity or quote unquote affinity groups, even if you don't have that affinity. I was and my colleague were both put in the white affinity group, even though neither of us identify as white. And so it didn't matter. We were being told, and again, you couldn't do this with another group, right? If I went up to somebody who was a light-skinned Black person and I told them, well, you're not Black, could you imagine doing that? First of all, can you imagine the hubris of doing that? But then, of course, the legal implications of doing that as working in a public institution. Finally, there's a tremendous amount of stereotyping and as Stephen mentioned, ignorance about who Jews are, about our history, about how we are all at once religion, culture, ethnicity, identity. And it's a hard topic, I think, for other people to understand. And not everybody comes to this with anger or hatred in their heart towards Jews, but by the DEI programming not including information about Jews, not including information about anti-Semitism, it just perpetuates the problem. And even perpetuates the anti-Semitism when we're told that Jews are white, wealthy, and powerful, and don't need protection. This is written about it. Some of you may have read, there was an article by Adam Milstein in the Jerusalem Post, and Jay Green wrote a report on this for the Heritage Foundation about essentially the DEI's Jewish problem, that Jews are both seen as oppressors and the oppressed. But for the purposes of DEI programming, we are defined as oppressors and of others. So Israel, Jews become the people perpetrating hatred and racism by definition. Okay, I think, let's see. Just a couple of other points. As you could imagine, this created a tremendously hostile work environment for my colleague and myself, as well as other Jews who did not speak up. And sadly is going to perpetuate a negative impact for future generations of people being trained to care for students on Stanford's campus. They will not benefit from accurate anti-Semitism training. They're going to be sent away with actually all these biases. And then when they have to work with a Jewish or Israeli student, are going to bring those biases into the consulting room. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say. I appreciate folks listening, and again the invitation, and I'll turn it back over to you, Stephen.
Doctor, thank you very, very much for your presentation. And I want to tell you that I respect very much and admire your courage in stepping up to the plate and filing the complaint and doing all the things you did before the complaint was filed. I mean, it's really important. It's very difficult to it's a difficult situation all around, and it's very little help. Everybody, even the people who probably agree with you usually stand by silently, and
that's right.
They don't want to be a target either.
That's right. Yeah,
and it's really something that has to be done. I just want to mention to everybody that some of you may not have seen it, but in my previous emails, I did have links to different materials that were pertinent to different presentations. And if any of you can't find that email, just after this afternoon or tonight, whenever you think about it, send me an email telling me that you need those links, and I'll resend them to you. The complaint speaks about certain types of remedies that might help. And maybe it's worthwhile mentioning them before we go to the next speaker. One, that Stanford must ensure that Jewish students receive the same level of care and attention that other students receive. It must provide the same level of clinical care to Jewish students who face anti-Semitism that it provides to students who are targets of other forms of prejudice. In order to meet this goal, Stanford should create a task force that provides input to CAPS. CAPS is the program of the counseling program, and the university's DEI programs about how to respond to anti-Semitic incidents on campus and how best to meet the therapeutic and clinical needs of the Jewish students at Stanford. Stanford must revise the CAPS DEI program so that it administers a comprehensive curriculum that is developed and taught by professional DEI educators and specifically addresses the different manifestations of anti-Semitism. I just want to mention myself that I think this is critical. DEI programs, there's a laudable goal for proper DEI programs. But they definitely, one of the goals should be to include Jews and should be to educate people about anti-Semitism. My own view is that Holocaust education has been tried for a while and hasn't really, I don't see that it's helped much in terms of anti-Semitism. I think we should directly have education about anti-Semitism, and DEI programs are an opportunity, and we have to push it. And there are some people, such as April Powers, who was mentioned, who is one of our speakers, who works on DEI, has worked in DEI positions, but deals with training people to cope with anti-Semitism. So there are other recommendations, and I don't want to take any more time from the next speakers, but I do recommend that you look at the materials. They are very useful. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Albuquerque. Thank you. So our next speaker, the Honorable Kenneth L. Marcus, is founder and chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. He's a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for Liberty and Law at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. He's author of the book, The Definition of Anti-Semitism, published by Oxford, and also of the book, Jewish Identity and Civil Rights in America, published by Cambridge. During his public service career, Ken served as Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, as staff director at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and as General Deputy Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. We're very honored to have Ken join us today, and his accomplishments and his efforts with respect to protecting Jewish students and fighting anti-Semitism can't be exaggerated. They're so great. In fact, at a previous program, I think one of the other illustrious speakers we had said that Ken is really the person in America who's done the most to protect Jewish students. And I think I would, at the time I felt awkward to echo that because we had other speakers, but I think that I would echo that. And I really do thank him so much for coming here. Ken's topic is, and if I don't, you'll see why I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to pronounce this correctly, but causing the harms they are intended to prevent, iatrogenesis in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Ken, please.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. I'm honored to be here. I almost feel that you just said that my accomplishments can't be exaggerated, only to go ahead and exaggerate them. I don't know that I could possibly live up to that. I also have to say, Steve, well, I'm honored. I mean, what you've done with the center is really extraordinary. I'm tempted to say that my job is done here. I think that between you and our client, Ron Albasher, you've really nailed this subject well. But I will be pleased if I can provide perhaps a few footnotes to the excellent text that the two of you have just developed. It's been an honor to represent Ron in the Stanford University case, where we are pursuing the complaint that Ron just described within the EEOC. Since Ron did such an extraordinary job of describing that case, I'll only say a few points about it. But let me first say that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, I would like to discuss it not because I think that they are a problem, but because I think that they are a solution. That is to say, while we've heard significant challenges that we face at Stanford and elsewhere with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, this is a considerable paradox and an irony, because these are precisely the programs that are intended to address such problems. There is perhaps some ambiguity in two ways of talking about DEI. On the one hand, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, we sometimes speak about the entire cluster of programs used by corporate entities, including universities, to comply with civil rights, to manage and facilitate a diversity among staff and students, to make people feel fully included and welcome, and to achieve the mission of the institution while fully embracing all of its peoples. In other words, it can be that broad. And to that extent, it's hard to deny its importance in any significant institution. The term can also be used, though, to describe a particular approach which has become so dominant within corporate and university life that we tend to think it's the only one. DEI is not a term that's been used forever and ever. It's relatively recent. We had for years had anti-discrimination and civil rights programs that focused perhaps better on achieving compliance with anti-discrimination rules, but which did not have as broad an approach, for instance, to making people feel fully included in their workplaces. We had for some years diversity management programs, which emphasized such worthy goals as ensuring that managers are able to fully appreciate talent, no matter how it is wrapped or what color and shape it might find itself in, and which helped institutions to achieve their goals in light of the diversity and uniformity among people. Those were different approaches. DEI is an approach which is so dominant that it seems the only one, but it's actually something of a trend or a fad. I think it's fairly certain that, like all trends, it will be succeeded by a different approach in the future to such issues as non-discrimination and the ways in which we might live better and more gently with one another. But for now, it is a particular approach which does have some significant problems, which Stanford is only one example of. Ron did such an extraordinary job that I don't want to belabor it, but I would like to highlight a few aspects of the Stanford problem, which again is before the EEOC. And I'll also say that while the case is still proceeding, it has already been quite influential. For example, in the context of this case, the Brandeis Center was able to conduct a webinar with two sitting members of the EEOC, Commissioner Andrea Lucas and Commissioner Keith Sonderling, both very distinguished public servants, who were able to really educate a significant swath of people to the problems with DEI. And since then, SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Managers, has helped to disseminate Commissioner Lucas and Commissioner Sonderling's views and to provide a greater awareness among some human resources managers that they cannot have a complete program of diversity and equity inclusion that doesn't include Jews and Jewish identity. Now, the problem at Stanford is, on the one hand, so shocking that it's hard to believe that it would exist at a distinguished institution. On the other hand, it's not something that is fully grasped by everyone. For example, not everyone understands the problem when Jewish individuals are asked to join a identity group for white or white adjacent people. But this includes Jews who consider, even if they are Ashkenazic, that Jewishness is not the same as whiteness. Of course, historically, Jews have been viewed as white or even hyper-white by white supremacists and others for whom whiteness is a negative value, while Jews have been considered to be colored by white supremacists and others who have animosity towards people of color. So in a sense, Jews have always been viewed in whatever light is most disdained by the viewer. Putting Jews in this way is a kind of a box that isn't necessarily chosen. Other groups aren't necessarily forced to take an identity that is prefabricated for them. At Brooklyn College, we have a client who identifies as a woman of color and as Hispanic. But because she's also Jewish, she's told that she can't identify as a person of color. The Jewishness, in a sense, trumps out. But it's not just a matter of erasing Jewish identity in the sense of telling Jews that they can't identify as Jews, they must identify as white, and therefore as privileged and oppressors. It goes a little bit beyond that, because the first move might be to put Jews into an undifferentiated whiteness. But the second move is usually to consider Jews to be hyper-white or more privileged than others, which then tends to lead to the stereotypes of power, control, greed, so on and so forth. And in that way, the erasure of Jewish identity then leads to this backdoor entry of some of the oldest and worst stereotypes of Jews. It's also coupled in this example at Stanford, but also elsewhere, with this erasure of the notion that Jews could ever be victims. Because after all, if Jews are part of the white power elite, Jews cannot be a marginalized group that needs to be addressed. That's why a DEI group might ignore something like a Zoom bombing of swastikas. The move is first to erase Jewish identity and then erase the possibility that Jews could be targeted for discrimination. And that's something that we see in lots of different places. Now, what we saw at Stanford is not unique to Stanford. Towards the beginning, Steve Resnikoff mentioned the example of Google, where a chief diversity officer was found to have used quite explicit anti-Jewish language in social media, saying that Jews have, quote, an insatiable appetite for war and killing, a close quote. Again, I want to stress that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, are supposed to address exactly that sort of hatred. So there is the irony when they're using it. Commissioner Andrea Lucas of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has acknowledged that anti-Semitism has become a significant problem in DEI programs. She has said, and I think correctly, that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts can be tremendously wonderful if done correctly. But if you are excluding Jews from that conversation, if you're ignoring the risks of engaging in anti-Semitic tropes, you can end up hurting the very people that you thought you were helping. Jay Green, a University of Arkansas professor working with James Paul for the University of Arkansas and also Heritage University, has done some interesting research on DEI at universities and looked into the question of whether DEI staff are in fact creating a tolerant and welcoming environment on college campuses. In particular, the Arkansas researchers searched the Twitter feeds of over 700 DEI personnel at 65 universities to find their public communications regarding Israel and, for purposes of comparison, China. What they found is that DEI staff tweeted, retweeted, or liked almost 3 times as many tweets about Israel as tweets about China. Of the tweets about Israel, 96% were critical of the Jewish state, while 62% of the tweets about China were favorable. There were more tweets narrowly referencing apartheid in Israel than tweets indicating anything favorable about Israel whatsoever. The overwhelming pattern, they said, is that DEI staff at universities pay a disproportionately high amount of attention to Israel and nearly always attack Israel. Now, they acknowledge that criticism of Israel is not always anti-Semitic, but they did find that the inordinate amount of attention given to Israel and the excessive criticism directed at that country is evidence of a double standard with respect to the Jewish state, which is a central feature of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. In other words, what they found within the DEI staff was an extraordinary volume of almost obsessive anti-Israel negative language, arguably consistent with anti-Semitic attitudes, including frequent accusations that Israel is engaging in genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. Green's explanation is that university DEI staff are better understood as political activists with a narrow and radical political agenda. That may or may not be true, but to describe what we see in DEI as simply being left-wing or radical, to me, doesn't fully illuminate the problem that we need to tackle, which is that DEI is not just a left-wing institution. It's a kind of a human rights institution. That is to say, it is an apparatus that is intended, among other things, to support minorities who otherwise might be liable for discrimination. So there is a paradox, but also a very deep problem when the apparatus that the institution uses to address discrimination is instead creating discrimination. After all, when students or faculty or other employees have a problem involving hate or bias incidents, they are told generally to go to some institution within DEI. It might be the DEI office, it might be the Equal Opportunity Office, but generally speaking, it is some part of DEI. So when DEI is infected, it is the very institution that is supposed to be protecting it. And we see this in lots of different contexts as well. Even aside from anti-Semitism, we see DEI programs within the corporate world worsening, in some cases, the challenges among employees. American Express trained employees to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities, then rank themselves on the hierarchy of privilege. AT&T taught its workforce that racism is a uniquely white trait and that white employees are the problem. Coca-Cola trained workers to be less white, i.e. less ignorant, less arrogant, less oppressive. CVS told employees that to be born in the United States is to literally have racist ideas rain on our head consistently and constantly. So what we're seeing is that the DEI portion of not just universities, but corporations are often disseminating stereotypes, including racial stereotypes, not just limited to anti-Semitism, but we're finding that Jewish Americans disproportionately bear the brunt of this. And it's not just DEI. I would say that this is one aspect of a broader problem, which is to say that oftentimes the anti-Semitism that we see today is connected in some sense with an institution that is intended to address such social problems. We see anti-Semitism, for instance, in the United Nations, which was in no small part founded to ensure no recurrence of the Holocaust, and not just within the United Nations, but within their Human Rights Council, the last place that should have this, because it's actually designed to address human rights problems. We see human rights organizations that are disseminating the worst anti-Israel defamations. We see social justice movements so frequently defaming Israel and using anti-Semitic canards that we almost become numb to it. And we don't think about the paradox that while we do see anti-Semitism on the streets, on the far right wing, in places like Charlottesville and QAnon, and while we see it in the sort of traditional right wing spaces, the last place we should see anti-Semitism is in fact one of the most common places we see it, which is, say, institutions that are intended to address the problem. And that's where we get to the question of iatrogenesis, which I hesitate to address too much in front of my client, a medical doctor, because it is in fact a medical term. There is, I would say, very little, if any, attention given within the civil and human rights world, or even within the legal world, to the question of how do we address the problem of unintended consequences of our actions? How do we address the problem that we, either as civil rights lawyers or as human rights workers or as DEI officials, are sometimes actually creating problems and not fixing them? This is, I would say, rampant in the United States, with anti-Semitism being a kind of a canary in the coal mine, which is to say, oftentimes it is the most visible aspect of the problem and an indicator of the problem, but it's a problem that goes much beyond Jews. Within the medical science, there's been an awareness for quite some time of the prospect that our efforts to heal can in fact cause harm. Of course, it goes back to Hippocrates and the notion of first do no harm. But we have also this notion of that the healer can cause harm, iatrogenesis being the notion that much of medical problems today result from medical science, medical interventions, and in particular, that it's often hospitals that are causing what's called nosocomial infections, or to say hospital-based infections. In other words, there has been for a few decades now exploration of the different ways in which healers may cause harm, a kind of discussion that hasn't really begun yet within the civil and human rights world or within the legal world. At Berkeley Law, there has been considerable discussion and debate about the fact that now over a dozen student organizations have adopted constitution and bylaw changes that would prevent people who support the state of Israel from even appearing as a speaker on any topic to these organizations. Within Berkeley, there's been a debate over, for example, whether this is unlawful, whether it is, as the dean suggests, constitutionally protected, whether it would, as the dean suggests, prevent himself and 90% of the Jewish law students from even speaking. But there hasn't been a serious self-questioning of how is it that we as a law school that is concerned about human rights are in fact potentially exacerbating a human rights problem. Similarly, at Stanford, how is it that within our university, it is the part of the university that is supposed to address discrimination that is itself exacerbating it? And throughout the human rights world, we have again and again this problem. Ivan Illich wrote several decades ago that the medical field is causing a significant part of the medical problems in the world, and shocked a lot of people at the time in a way that then actually became somewhat commonplace as an understanding decades later. And now, within the medical field, there are constant steps that are being taken to address whether it is airborne infections in hospitals, whether it is infections caused by wounds, whether it is harms caused by various sorts of misdiagnosis. And yet there's very little or anything of that done within the human rights world. Illich identified 3 different levels of iatrogenesis: clinical, social, and cultural. His observation was that within hospitals and various medical facilities, one could see through inadequate standards of care various sorts of harm being caused. But beyond that, that at a societal level, the over-medicalization, the overly frequent resort to medical interventions was multiplying the number of problems that were caused by unnecessary surgery and other sorts of problems. Jay Green, the same social scientist whom I mentioned a little while ago, has also provided eye-opening research on the extent to which diversity, equity, and inclusion staff have multiplied in recent years within universities, which is to say, and DEI is just one example, what we have is a similar social iatrogenesis, an oversaturation of programs that, when done properly, should be for the good, but which are in fact leading to harm. The third kind, identified by Illich, was cultural iatrogenesis, which is to say the tendency of over-medicalization to lead to a decline in the traditional ways of addressing harm. And here again, what we have with respect to the civil and human rights field is such a saturation of the diversity world that we have a sort of a withering of other efforts. And to some extent, some of it is intentional. At many DEI programs, the voguish approach could be described as anti-racist. And some of the materials distributed at Stanford through the DEI program could be described in that way. Anti-racism training is now quite frequent, not just in university DEI programs, but also in corporate programs. But anti-racism is not the opposite of racism. If by racism we mean either prejudice on the basis of race or different treatment to people based on their race, the opposite of racist is not racist. Ibram X. Kendi, one of the leading intellectuals of the anti-racist movement, has argued that the claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. I would argue the opposite is true. He defines racism as a combination of policies and ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Now, one could take different positions on inequities and racial inequities, including whether they are all based on racial discrimination or whether some have other causes. But racial equities or inequities are not necessarily the same as either prejudice or different treatment. This sort of quote unquote racism often has nothing to do with individual discrimination. And the problem, he emphasizes that focusing on racial discrimination takes our eyes off the policy goals that he and other self-proclaimed anti-racists prefer. But the problem is that the anti-racists argue that we instead take our eyes off of racial discrimination. That is to say, focus on racial inequities at the expense of focusing on different treatment or discrimination. That might be why many within the field are less focused on specific forms of different treatment. I found during my experience at OCR that we were able to, at the U.S. Department's Office for Civil Rights, that we were able to find and address a far greater volume of discriminatory incidents because we were focused specifically on people who were being treated differently based on their race, color, gender, or ethnicity, as opposed to other administrations that have taken a more systemic approach, looking not at different treatment, but rather at systemic approaches. In other words, the anti-racist or systemic approach to race will often lead to ignoring actual different treatment where it occurs. For this reason, it seems to me that the E in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is problematic because it includes equity as opposed to equality. In other words, by its nature, it shifts our attention away from actual discrimination that's taking place and creates a likelihood of increasing the problem rather than decreasing it. The example of medical science can provide us with a helpful metaphor and also a resort to a significant existing literature on different ways of approaching the harms that we inadvertently cause as healers. And what I would say is that the sorts of examples we talk about when we talk about DEI are not just left-wing anti-Semitism or not just left-wing discrimination, but they are more specifically and more problematically examples of people who go into the field in order to reduce discrimination and improve racial relations, and instead make them worse. Well, we have approaches that we can find in the medical field that have very useful applications. Certainly, with respect to clinical iatrogenesis, the basic principle of first thing, do no harm, avoid iatrogenic effects. The general approach, it seems to me, should not be to do the two things that people are most likely to suggest in response to DEI programs. One response that I get is, let's not talk about them at all. It's just too controversial to talk about anti-Semitism and DEI because people will misunderstand. Nobody says if there's an outbreak of an infection at the hospital, don't talk about it because people will misunderstand. They'll ask questions like what disinfectant agent is required for what period of time and so on and so forth. The other approach that I'm often told is, well, we should get rid of DEI altogether because it is having a perverse effect. But that would be a little bit like saying, well, let's eliminate the hospitals because they're making people sick. Again, the response should be to develop appropriate standards of care. The first aspect usually has to do with better training. Matt Gonzalez of the SHRM, this is Society of Human Resources Managers, recently argued that employers should carefully audit DEI content and ensure that these efforts do not contribute to anti-Semitism through assumptions, stereotypes of power, privilege, or racial identity, or conclusions based on racial or ethnic disparities. Close quote. I don't know that that's something that anybody would have been talking about prior to the Stanford case. It was only after the Stanford case, the comments of Commissioners Lucas and Sonderling, and the resulting webinar, that there's been this increasing attention. It should be somewhat shocking that such professionals now have gotten to the point that they're saying that it's not just corporations or universities that should be audited for anti-Semitism, but the very institutions that are supposed to deal with anti-Semitism themselves have become breeding grounds, much like an operating room where there's an infection being spread. Of course, prevention is a key. Commissioner Sonderling recommends that we specifically address anti-Semitism in anti-harassment, anti-discrimination, and diversity initiatives and policies. And I think that that's just right. But I would also say that there should be a fuller rethinking of DEI, and not just leaving these programs as they are, but including anti-Semitism and Jewish identity. We also have to ask whether these programs are developing stereotypes for other groups as well, and whether they are using stereotypes and binaries of, for instance, BIPOC versus white supremacists. There are many other approaches within the medical science field that have analogies here. Regular monitoring is considered basic in an approach to iatrogenesis, and I think it's necessary for DEI programs as well. Gonzalez, again, in response in part to the Stanford case, said that the DEI program should educate HR and DEI personnel, managers, and employees about anti-Semitism, including religious stereotypes and conspiracies. Individuals involved in DEI initiatives should look inward and determine whether they are focusing too much on the collective, viewing employees as part of a category instead of as unique individuals. So what I would say, is sort of in summation, is that among all of the different things that we see from the Stanford case is not just that it's extreme, but also that it is representative of a much broader problem. It's a problem within DEI, which is the last place we should see it, but it's also a problem more generally among civil and human rights professionals who have not yet begun, just as lawyers have not yet begun, to do the inward looking and soul searching that medical doctors have long since done. The key, I think, is for those of us who care about issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, who care about non-discrimination, who care about ensuring equal treatment of everyone, to look very carefully at all of the different ways in which our interventions are causing the opposite of the results that we're trying to achieve. And it seems to me that the case that Ron has described provides not just a particular example of a kind of injustice that's happening at what is otherwise, I would argue, a great institution, but also a real indication that there should be serious soul searching and a very careful and rigorous approach to iatrogenic or healer-caused harms within our field, which is similar in scope and effect to what the medical science has developed over the years, and which is in as serious need of addressing.
So thank you so much. You know, I have to tell you that one of our board members, Aaron Gotthelf, was fielding all the questions, and there were so many questions, and unfortunately we don't have any time to ask the questions because now we're behind schedule, and that's probably my fault, and I take responsibility. But it's terrific. You have written on this. I think in an email that I sent out to everybody who registered, I included a link to another video presentation that you made at Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. So that might answer, if people will go there, maybe that'll answer some of the questions. But I thank you so much. And it's interesting. I don't know if you mentioned, I can't recall whether you mentioned, but I think you yourself are a graduate of Bolt Law School, right? So it's
I am, yes. We don't call it Bolt anymore. And our wisdom, we no longer mention the name of Bolt because he was discriminatory towards Asians. Instead, we only call it Berkeley Law in honor of Bishop George Barclay, a slaveholder. But that's another story.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. As soon as I can figure out what button to push on my computer. Oh, I thought it was joking, but it turns out that I wasn't joking. The next speaker, and I have to ask him to please unmute himself if he hasn't done it already, is Jason Bedrick. He's a research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and he's a former legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and a former research fellow at the Josiah Bartlett, that sounds somehow like the West Wing, right? Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. His topic is higher education and attitudes towards Jews, measuring anti-Semitism using double standards. And just take me a minute to...
Well, sure. Thank you, Dr. Reznikov, so much for inviting me to be a part of this illustrious panel. Yes, the Josiah Bartlett Center is named for the real founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence, not the fake TV president who in the West Wing universe was the great-great-great-grandson of the real figure. But that's not why I'm here today. As you noted, I'm here to talk about actually another study by Dr. Jay Green, my colleague at the Heritage Foundation. Ken Marcus noted two of Jay's studies, one of which I put in the comment section. But I actually wanted to talk about a third study. I will share my screen here so that, wait a second here. Of course, I have to give permissions to Zoom to allow it. Oh man. Sorry, a second here. All right. Well, it looks like it doesn't want to do permissions, so I will just on my own discuss what's going on, and you won't have the benefit of seeing the beautiful slides that I put together. But the research question that I wanted to address is, are anti-Semitic attitudes affected by an individual's level of education? Now, there has been a number of studies that have looked at this. For example, Wheel in the 1990s actually compiled a number of studies. And what he found was that better educated people are much less anti-Semitic than the worse educated people in the United States, and that no other measure of social status, so for example, income or occupation, can account for this relationship. Likewise, you may be more familiar with the Anti-Defamation League's Global 100 Survey of Anti-Semitism, which has concluded that among Christians and the non-observant, higher levels of education lead to fewer anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, you'll note that they say Christians because this is a global study. And one thing that they find is that Muslims, when they have higher levels of education, at least internationally, this may not be true in the United States and Europe, but of course, this study included Turkey and Iran and other countries like that. Higher educated Muslims actually did have higher levels of anti-Semitic attitudes. So why do we care about this? Well, essentially, there are some different theories about why it is that education may lead to, in the West anyway, lower levels of anti-Semitism. One is the psychodynamic theory, which is essentially that better educated people tend to better tolerate diversity due to their privileged social station. So in other words, they're better able to tolerate outgroups because they perceive these outgroups as less threatening. Another theory is working class authoritarianism, which is essentially to say that anti-Semitism and other authoritarian attitudes are more prevalent among the working class, less educated Americans due to a subculture that does not readily embrace liberal norms to the degree that they are recognized among the upper strata of society. And I should note here that when I'm talking about education, what I really mean is being credentialed, right? Because I'm sure we have all met people who may not have a college degree, and yet we would consider them to be very highly educated. On the other hand, we may know people even who went to the Ivy League, and you wonder how they tie their shoes in the morning. So when I'm talking about levels of education here, really I'm talking about levels of credentials. But in any case, the idea is that those who are more highly educated or credentialed in the United States are more likely to embrace liberal norms, right? So in other words, elites truly respect liberal norms while non-elites do not, and that this is less a function of education than it is really of socialization, that those who go to college are then socialized in these liberal norms in a way that working class Americans who don't go to college are not. Another theory is that knowledge overcomes prejudice. So in 2012, Wodke said, an advanced education attenuates prejudice and fosters a real commitment to racial equality by providing knowledge about the historical, social, and economic forces responsible for inequality, teaching the dangers of prejudice, neutralizing fear of the unknown, promoting democratic norms of equality and civil rights, and facilitating contact between racial groups. In other words, that the project of DEI, at least as it might be in theory, would lead to people who have lower levels of racial animus, who are more committed to racial equality. This is, in other words, essentially a social justice case for why knowledge would, more knowledge, more education would lead to lower levels of anti-Semitism. However, maybe we're sort of like, there's an old joke about a man who thought his wife was going deaf, and he was asking her to wear a hearing aid, and she said, there's nothing wrong with her hearing. And so one day he devises a test, and he comes in to his house, and he calls out, Martha, what's for dinner? And she doesn't reply. So he takes 10 steps forward, and he says again, Martha, what's for dinner? But she doesn't reply. And so then he gets right behind her and he says, Martha, what's for dinner? And she says, Harold, for the third time, chicken. So what's the connection here? It could be that we are actually starting with a faulty premise, and that we are using a test that has some limitations that ends up confirming our mistaken belief about what the true cause of the problem is. So in this case, I think the issue is that we think that the source of the problem is people have low levels of education, and then for one of the various reasons that we described, they're going to have more anti-Semitic attitudes. Or maybe most people have anti-Semitic attitudes, but at least they haven't been exposed to the treatment of education. And so the solution would be, as Stanton and Marcus put it in the forward in 2019, the only thing that will truly halt the rise of anti-Semitism in America is education. And so what we should do is we should try to boost education generally. We should be supporting policies that get more people into college. We should be supporting things like Holocaust education. And specifically, we should be supporting things like diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And we're essentially going to educate our way out of the problem of anti-Semitism. But the previous research has some limitations, because when you're asking in surveys, and that's primarily what the ADL and others are doing, they're asking questions like, do you believe that Jews have too much power, in the banking industry, or too much power in the media or the government? In other words, what you're essentially asking is, are you an anti-Semite? And so, Muslims in the Middle East who have been inculcated with certain beliefs, or maybe Kanye West, if you ask Kanye West, do you think Jews have too much power? Are you an anti-Semite? He says, yes, absolutely, I think so. But not everybody is Kanye West, right? So the people who are more sophisticated, who have been educated to know that anti-Semitism is wrong, they may still hold anti-Semitic beliefs, but because they are more sophisticated and they understand what the survey is trying to do, they're going to give the more socially desirable answer. And that's going to fail to reveal their actual anti-Semitism. Right? If you were to do a follow-up question, maybe they'd say, yeah, no, of course, I have no problem with Jews. As a matter of fact, I love a lot of Jews. Peter Beinart is great, and Noam Chomsky, and the good Jews. Those are the ones that I really like. My only problem is, of course, with those Zionists, right? And we see this going on in college campuses a lot, that anti-Semitism is often just thinly masked as anti-Zionism, even though it's clearly something else. So Albert Cheng, Jay Green, and Ian Kingsbury decided to find another way of testing this question. They have a study out. It's called "Are More Highly Educated Individuals More Anti-Semitic? Findings Based on a New Approach to Measuring Anti-Semitism Using Double Standards," which I will provide a link after my discussion. And what they essentially do is they take Natan Sharansky's definition of anti-Semitism, which in his definition, he says that a defining feature of anti-Semitism is the double standard, right? So that Jews are held to a certain standard that others are not held to, or, for example, that Israel is held to a standard that other nations are not held to. And that this is strong, maybe even prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism when you see this double standard. So what Cheng, Green, and Kingsbury did is a survey of a nationally representative sample of about 1,800 respondents that used a split sample method. So they essentially asked two versions of the same question, one asking respondents to apply a principle to a Jewish example, and another asking them to apply a principle to a non-Jewish example. So, in each case, people may disagree over the principle that is at stake, but if they are more harsh in their treatment of Jews, in other words, they want to apply this principle more harshly in the Jewish example than in the non-Jewish example, then this is indicative, perhaps, of anti-Semitism. I think it's reasonable to infer that there is anti-Semitism, at least in this general population, because again, the respondents are only going to see one of the two. They're not asked both questions. They're only seeing one or the other, and because it is randomized whether or not they see the question about the Jews or the question about non-Jews, there really should be no difference in how they answer. So here is where the presentation that you're missing would really come alive, because you would get to see all the beautiful charts and graphs that I put together. But essentially, so it's worth diving into the data itself. So one of the questions that they asked is about, it says, many cities recently issued and then relaxed orders forbidding public gatherings to reduce the spread of coronavirus. This was asked in the study, which was, I believe it was toward the ends of 2020 or the early 2021. So this is, sort of just after the shutdowns. When those orders were in effect, the question continues, some groups nevertheless had public gatherings. And now here is where the question diverges. Half of the sample would get the question that says, for example, in New York, large groups of Orthodox Jews gathered for funerals in support, right? And then, do you believe that these violations posed a threat to public health and should have been prevented? The other half of the sample got the same exact question, except instead of large groups of Orthodox Jews gathering for funerals, it said large groups of protesters gathered for demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter. Now, when you ask this question, the general public answers yes, that this is a threat to public health and should have been prevented, at 61% for both. And so what we're looking at here is not, there's a legitimate difference of opinion over whether this principle should be applied in these cases, but there shouldn't be a difference between the two groups, and there isn't for the general public, right? The general public says, 61% of the general public says, yes, having large gatherings of people during coronavirus is a bad idea. It's a threat to public health. It should be prevented. and whether that large group is Jews at a funeral or whether that large group is Black Lives Matter protesters, the coronavirus knows no religion, knows no ethnicity, and both are a public threat. And above 40% say it's not a public threat. But for those who have a 4-year degree, things actually start to diverge. So 74% answered in the affirmative with regard to the Jews, whereas only 63% answered in the affirmative with regard to Black Lives Matters. In other words, you have a gap of about 10%. So this is indicative of a higher level, perhaps, of anti-Semitic views in this population. It gets even worse among those with advanced degrees, where 78% said that they had, the Orthodox Jewish funerals should be halted, whereas only 42% said the same of Black Lives Matters. In other words, a gap of about 40%. So the more educated you are, right, the general public sees no difference between these two. When there's a 4-year degree, all of a sudden it's about a 10% gap. And now with an advanced degree, it's close to a 40% gap in these two situations. Another question that was asked is whether people believe that having an attachment to another nation creates a conflict of interest. And in this case, the same exact question is asked, except in one case, half of the sample is asked about Israel, the other half of the sample is asked about Mexico. Now, in the general population, there is actually a 5% gap. 32% say that an attachment to Israel creates a conflict of interest. 27% say that there's a conflict of interest when it comes to Mexico. But the gap starts to widen with 4-year degrees, 26 to 19, and then gets even significantly wider with an advanced degree, 35% to 22%. Again, in this case, taking a principle and more harshly applying that principle against Jews than they do against those who have an attachment to Mexico. In a third case, they asked a question about regulating Orthodox Jewish day schools versus regulating Montessori schools. Now, in this case, the question discusses a disagreement about the extent to which the government should regulate what is taught in private schools, and says the following: for example, some people have expressed concerns that either Orthodox Jewish schools or Montessori schools do not cover the same academic material required in public schools, while others believe those schools should be free to choose their curriculum. Do you believe the government should establish minimum requirements for what is taught in private schools? The general public is fairly close on this. It's 53 to 49, slightly more harsh toward the Jews. In this case, a 4-year degree is even, 54-54. And an advanced degree, there's actually, they were slightly more likely to apply the principle to Montessori than to the Jews, but also significantly more likely to desire regulation. So 67% to 70% saying that the government should take a more active role in regulating these schools. So at least on this question, there didn't seem to be evidence of a double standard. Of course, what we did see, and this is why we need to ask multiple different questions, because there's other things going on with these questions as well. That's why you need to approach it from multiple different angles. In this case, it seems that the more educated you are, the more likely that you want the experts in government to be regulating what's going on in private schools. And so that may be swamping any other considerations. But at least on this question, does not seem to be evidence of a double standard. The last question is, and I think this is the one that of all of them gets the closest to really demonstrating a double standard. And that's the question over whether the military should ban the wearing of head coverings. In one case, it discusses a Jew who had sued the military because he wanted to wear a kippah. In the other case, it talked about a Sikh who had sued the military because he wanted to wear a turban. And the question was, should we be siding with the religious minority, or should we be siding with the military? The general public on both questions is split about 50-50. Those with a 4-year degree are split. It's 44%, 43%, but pretty much statistically the same. But those with an advanced degree, all of a sudden there is a significant gap. 51% side against the Jew, whereas only 39% side with the military against the Sikh. And so, more than a 10% gap there. All right. If we take the average of the percent of the population responding yes across all 4 items, we see that the general public only has a 2% gap between how they apply these principles to Jews versus how they apply these principles to non-Jews. But that increases. Those with a 4-year degree, it's just shy of 5%. And those with an advanced degree, there's about a 15% gap between how they apply these principles to Jews versus how they apply these principles to non-Jews. All right, so what are the implications of this study? Essentially, the issue is that we might be misdiagnosing the source of the threat. It is comfortable for Jews, especially most Jews who are higher educated than the general public, tend to be in the upper middle and upper income levels. It is comforting perhaps to think that the source of the anti-Semitic threat is not nearby. It's not our friends and neighbors. It's not people in the institutions that we saw as the great equalizing force in this country, this meritocratic system of colleges and universities that allowed Jews, after we got over the discrimination, that allowed Jews to sort of climb the social ladder. It's comforting to think that's not where the threat is. The threat is really out in the hinterland. It's low educated, often religious Christians who lack a college education, and then all we have to do then is to properly educate them. But if we are mistaken about where the threats to our interests predominate, then we may forego alliances that may be actually in our interest, right? So you see Jews that see high levels of support, let's say, for Israel among evangelicals, and then some Jews dismiss this as, oh, well, it's just for theological reasons. They're trying to usher in the end times that they think are going to be very bad for Jews. And so we maybe dismiss potential allies, and possibly we also may make excuses for those who really are threatening the interests of Jewish people, because we see them as, well, they're more educated. These really are our friends and allies. So this may be an issue. Secondly, we might be proposing improper solutions, right? So if our strategies for addressing intolerance is to, let's do more Holocaust education, let's put all our resources into getting more kids into college, we may be putting our eggs essentially in the wrong baskets, not only in ways that might not be effective, but in ways that might be counterproductive. And we might also be misunderstanding the role of DEI in all this. Even Ken was discussing the way that DEI could potentially work, if Jews were adequately included in the curriculum. But maybe DEI is just too wedded to concepts of critical race theory that see people in the roles of oppressed and oppressor, and that put Jews in that oppressor category. And maybe that's so baked into the entire worldview that informs DEI that it would be a mistake to try to co-opt DEI. Maybe instead we should be seeking to shut it down. Now, look, unlike with Harold and Martha, This study is not conclusive like Harold's study, if you could call it that. This is just one data point. And so we should be good Bayesians. That means that we should update our priors when we gain additional information. So I'm not saying that this one study is concrete evidence that education itself is a bad thing, or at least that education in the United States, the way it is done, is a bad thing, that it is inherently anti-Semitic, but it should certainly call into question the assumption that many in the Jewish community have had that education automatically leads to more positive feelings toward Jewish people, or that education on its own is going to attenuate anti-Semitic impulses. There is a critique that some might have of this study, which is that in many of these cases, what is happening is not that it's not that these questions, where there's a double standard, are detecting an antipathy toward Jews so much as that it is detecting additional sympathy for particular minority groups, whether those are Sikhs or Mexicans or African Americans. So in other words, they're just more sympathetic. But I think even there, when there is this evidence of the double standard, it is showing that for many people, Jews don't count. That there is this additional level of sympathy that is extended to other religious and ethnic minorities, but that this additional level of sympathy, because of something that seems to be going on in higher ed, possibly related to DEI, is not inculcating additional sympathy toward the Jews. And so I think even there, I think we could say that there is some underlying anti-Semitic tendency. If this is all correct, I mean, Ruth Weiss, in a great essay in National Affairs in 2015, said anti-Semitism is an ideology that anchors or forms part of a political movement and serves a political purpose. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that. Jay Green, one of the co-authors of the study, comments on that. Those political causes making use of anti-Semitism are increasingly favored by the well-educated in this country. Countering the anti-Semitism of the well-educated will be a political and moral struggle, not one that can be addressed by conventional approaches and conceptions of education. So with that, I thank you very much. And
Jason,
Dr. Resnikoff, I'll turn it back to you.
Presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation. And maybe you'd be willing to share your slides, and I can send it out by email to all the people who registered.
Sure.
If that would be okay with you. Thank you so much. And
I just put the link in the chat to the study.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so the next presenter is Susanna Sherry. She is the Herman O. Lowenstein Professor of Law Emerita at Vanderbilt Law School. She's published 3 scholarly books, 4 textbooks, more than 80 articles and book chapters on a broad range of constitutional issues in federal court jurisdiction. She's a graduate of Middlebury College and the University of Chicago Law School. She's written a lot on the topic that she's going to speak about, and I've used her articles in the course I teach on anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and the law, and I think you're going to enjoy her speech very much. Let me just...
I'm here and I'm unmuted.
There you are. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to all of the audience. Today's program asks us to consider whether anti-Semitic influences in DEI programs can be corrected. My unequivocal answer is no. So I have to disagree with Ken Marcus that we can fix these programs. Instead, we have to get rid of them, for the simple reason that the core beliefs behind the DEI movement are incompatible with Jewish success in American society, and thus are at base anti-Semitic. So I'm going to focus not on the practice of DEI, as several of the other commentators have, but rather on its theoretical underpinnings. And my thesis is that the DEI movement necessarily and inevitably incorporates anti-Semitic beliefs. So let's start with the two most basic tenets of DEI. They're the same as the principles underlying critical race theory of the 1980s and 1990s and the anti-racism and woke movements of today. The first principle is a rejection of what one commentator called the universal values of the Enlightenment: objectivity, rationality, science, equality, and freedom of the individual. Instead, these Enlightenment values are seen as merely the way that whites dominate or subjugate people of color. What we think of as objective truth is merely a reflection of the biases of the people who propound that truth. And in the United States, it means that white truths and white values are privileged. Second, American society is pervaded by systemic racism, sometimes called structural racism. All whites are racist, whether they recognize it or not, and the whole society is deliberately structured by whites in ways that keep whites in power. In particular, standards of merit and of success are structured to favor whites and white values. Critical race theorists have labeled everything from linear thinking to hard work to delayed gratification, all of which contribute to success in modern society, as aspects of whiteness that should not be forced on other cultures. The DEI movement, in attributing all racial disparities to racism and discrimination, buys into both of these principles. And together, these principles explain most, if not all, of the demands of the DEI movement. So, implicit bias training is necessary to combat systemic racism. Racial diversity is a way to ensure that white values and white beliefs do not dominate. Non-white values must be included. And equity, that is, equality of results rather than equality of opportunity or anti-discrimination, can only be accomplished by removing the artificial barriers that whites call merit, such as high test scores or successful completion of required tasks. So here are some examples of these ideas in action. Numerous selective public high schools have eliminated or are being pressured to eliminate their objective admissions tests. These include Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, which eliminated its test in favor of a holistic admissions process, which is currently being challenged in federal court. Lowell High School in San Francisco, which first instituted and then abandoned a lottery system. Lowell, in fact, recently brought back objective admissions tests after several school board members lost recall elections and the number of first-year students receiving D's or F's tripled. And Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which so far has resisted numerous calls to change its admissions standards. Many colleges and universities are following suit by making SAT or ACT tests optional for applicants. Many colleges and universities are also requiring candidates for faculty positions or for tenure or promotion within the university to submit what they call diversity statements that detail how they and their work advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. At Berkeley, some candidates are rejected purely on the basis of the insufficiency of the diversity statements without any consideration of the quality of their actual scholarship or teaching. Some professional academic organizations, including a major psychology organization, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, are now requiring those who want to give talks at the organization's annual meeting to, quote, indicate how their presentation advances the equity and anti-racism goals of the organization. In line with DEI beliefs, scholars are judged by their commitment to DEI goals instead of by the merit of their work, because we can't judge merit. Also consider the calls for a new K-12 mathematics curriculum, which again has already been adopted in some places. It was developed as a response to the achievement gap between Black and white students in STEM fields. The new curriculum evaluates students not by whether they get the right answer or learn the material, but instead by whether they are eager to learn. Getting the right answer is a white thing and therefore racist. Eagerness to learn is neutral and therefore anti-racist and inclusive. Then there's a recent guest lecture scheduled by the University of Oregon Physics Department. The lecture, titled Scientists versus Science, Race, Gender, and Anti-Intellectualism in Science, was advertised thusly, and here I quote, "Black thought can help us free science from the white supremacist traditions of scientists. Scientists versus Science will use Black feminist and anti-colonialist analyses to show that white supremacy is a total epistemic system that affects even our most, quote, objective areas of knowledge production. The talk hinges on the development of the concept of white empiricism, which I introduced to give a name to the way that anti-intellectual white supremacy plays a role in physicists' analysis of empirical data." This lecture thus exemplifies DEI's underlying belief that race is everything. Even claims of knowledge or scientific expertise cannot be evaluated apart from the race of those who claim to know. These are just a few examples of DEI in action. Other panelists have identified many more that are more directly tied to academia. But I provide these examples merely to illustrate DEI's underlying belief that all whites are racist, that all of society is structured to keep whites in power and people of color subjugated, and that all racial disparities are the result of structural or systemic racism. My primary focus is on the implications of those beliefs. The notion that our society is systematically racist, structured by whites to keep whites in power, is problematic when it comes to Jews, and not coincidentally to Asian Americans for largely the same reasons. The problem is that Jews and some groups of Asian Americans outperform non-Jewish whites on just about every measure of success: educational attainment, income, career status, family integrity, lack of criminality, and I could go on and on. Jews are overrepresented in law, in medicine, and in higher education. Asian Americans are overrepresented in STEM fields. And this overrepresentation is despite the fact that most colleges and universities capped Jewish enrollment until a generation ago, as Stanford University recently acknowledged, and they continue to cap Asian American enrollment. A movement like DEI, which rejects the notion of objective merit and instead blames disparities in rates of success on racism, cannot explain this extraordinary Jewish success except by resort to anti-Semitic stereotypes. After all, Jews can't possibly have succeeded on their merits because there's no such thing as objective merit. Instead, there is a systematically racist power structure that ensures success for some people and not for others. But why in the world would powerful white racists structure things to allow Jews and Asian Americans to surpass them? The only possible answers to this DEI conundrum are anti-Semitic. I think there are 4 possibilities, all of them resting on traditional anti-Semitic tropes. The first possible explanation is that a Jewish conspiracy is behind America's systemic racism. It's not whites in general, but Jews who are pulling the strings and exercising power. Of course, as all of you know, claims of a Jewish conspiracy of power have a long and sordid history, including the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which seems to keep attracting believers despite its being proved a hoax over and over again. And unfortunately, these days, believers in this hoax are as likely to be progressive people of color as they are to be white supremacists. A second explanation is an alternative version of the first. It is that American culture, including its inherent racism, is actually Jewish culture. And like the claim of a Jewish conspiracy, blaming Jews for the evils of mainstream culture has a long anti-Semitic pedigree. Jews have been blamed for capitalism and, ironically, for communism. Also, ironically, Blacks have also been blamed for everything from sexual promiscuity to the drug culture. DEI adherents and their allies, of course, attribute such things as high rates of illegitimacy and drug use among some Black communities to racism, and they seem unaware that DEI itself cannot escape scapegoating Jews the same way that racists blame Blacks for the ills of American culture. A third explanation for Jewish success is that Jews are sycophants and mimics who slither their way into the white power structure through a singular focus on money and success. This too draws on long-standing anti-Semitic stereotypes. 19th century French socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon characterized the Jew as an intermediary, always fraudulent and parasitical. Jewish academic success in the early 20th century led one American anti-Semite to describe Jews as clever, acute, and industrious rather than able. That view was shared by academic institutions. In the first half of the 20th century, many elite colleges and universities, including most of the Ivies, introduced character as a qualification for admission, and Jews were found to be lacking in character. As late as 1950, Yale's president, Alfred Whitney Griswold, reassured alumni that the Yale man of the future would not be a, quote, beetle-proud, highly specialized intellectual, but a well-rounded man. Everyone knew, although few admitted publicly, that this was a coded reference to Yale's desire to avoid being overrun by New York City Jews. And even into the 1970s, Yale and most of the other Ivies were asking applicants for their mother's maiden name to help identify Jews with non-Jewish surnames. I should note that all of the anti-Semitic explanations for Jewish success have counterparts for Asian American success. Although I haven't focused on Asian Americans, here I can't help but point out the similarities. Long-standing stereotypes paint Asian Americans as unoriginal, uncreative mimics who succeed only because they grind away at rote tasks. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to Harvard's admission process brought by Asian American plaintiffs, and in an eerie reflection of how Harvard treated Jews in the first half of the 20th century, these Asian American plaintiffs allege that Harvard is capping the number of Asian Americans it admits by rejecting them for their supposed character and personality deficiencies. Back to the possible explanations for Jewish success. The last possible explanation for Jewish success is that they are essentially pawns that powerful whites use to deflect the charge of racism. That is a way to say, see, minorities can succeed in our society. This essentially makes Jews guilty as collaborators or worse. In fact, one of the founders of critical race theory, the late Harvard law professor Derek Bell, published a story to illustrate the role of Blacks and Jews in American society. In a story called The Space Traders, space aliens offer Americans untold wealth and other benefits in exchange for allowing the aliens to take all Black Americans away with them to meet an unknown fate. One of the few groups that courageously takes a stand against the deal is the Jews, who denounce the alien proposal as genocidal and form a secret Anne Frank society to organize resistance. Sounds good? Not so fast. According to Bell's story, it turns out that Jewish motives are not so noble after all. And here again, I quote, "A concern of many Jews not contained in their official condemnations of the trade offer was that in the absence of Blacks, Jews would become the scapegoats of a racist system." End quote. In other words, this is my language, Jews succeed only because they go along with and benefit from white racism. Now, such an explicitly anti-Semitic explanation for Jewish success, from a Harvard law professor no less, is rare, but it is one of the few explanations available if we accept the principles underlying DEI. DEI's inherent anti-Semitism thus rests on its inability to explain Jewish success without resorting to anti-Semitic stereotypes. But the implications of DEI beliefs have an even more direct link to anti-Semitism. In short, to attack meritocracy and to attribute disparities entirely to racism, as the DEI movement does, is essentially to argue that Jewish success is undeserved. And that's a patently anti-Semitic conclusion. And if Jewish and Asian American success is undeserved, those groups are fair game for attacks. So it's not a coincidence that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence is rising sharply among those on the far left of all races, and that the majority of recent incidents of anti-Asian violence were committed by Black perpetrators. None of this should be surprising. DEI, like its cousin, critical race theory, is essentially a rejection of and attack on the principles of rationality and objectivity that underlay the European Enlightenment and ultimately formed the backbone of American democracy. And historically, attacks on the Enlightenment and on the norms of scientific objectivity have long been associated with anti-Semitism. French counter-revolutionists, German romantics, and Nazi theorists have championed an orthodoxy that rejects rationality in favor of dogmatism and have blamed Jews for undermining or resisting that orthodoxy. Today's identity politics adherents, including the champions of DEI, do the same. Indeed, John McWhorter, a Columbia University linguist and public intellectual who happens to be Black, insightfully argues that the whole movement that includes DEI, anti-racism, and wokeness is, in all but name, a religion and is trying to cleanse the society of heretics. Jews, unfortunately, have always been seen as the most heretical group of all. There's no reason to expect the religion of the woke to be any less dangerous to Jews than were its predecessors. Ironically, far-right nationalists like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers have much in common with DEI. They believe in only their own irrational truths, like the 2020 election was stolen, or in the case of DEI, that all disparities are caused by racism. And they blame the nation's problems and their own on a conspiracy of the powerful. And the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are anti-Semitic. The only difference between them and DEI is their views on race. I want to close by emphasizing that my condemnation of DEI does not mean that we should ignore the very real racial disparities that exist in this country. But we can and should recognize the disparities and try to rectify them without necessarily assigning blame, and certainly without blaming every white person, including every Jew. DEI does exactly the opposite. It blames whites and does nothing to rectify racial disparities. Indeed, DEI may make those disparities worse. Mandatory diversity training has been shown to be harmful to race relations, increasing white resentment and backlash. Labeling all people of color as victims of white racism makes them out to be helpless pawns of powerful whites, unable to control their own lives. Watering down basic math or science education in the name of equity means that Black students will be unable to compete in STEM fields. And universities hiring more and more and more diversity administrators takes funding away from the educational mission, and that which is a mission that helps the poor and marginalized students much more than it helps those who already have advantages. And it doesn't, and hiring these administrators doesn't actually increase diversity. DEI and its kindred movements actually stand in the way of finding real solutions. To solve the problem of racial disparities, we first have to identify the causes. But DEI adherents insist, despite all evidence to the contrary, that there is one and only one cause of those disparities: systemic racism, past or present. To even suggest that anything else, including, say, Black cultural norms or Black family structures, might contribute to the disparities is taboo and leads to being labeled a racist. So DEI not only fails to address racial disparities, it prevents anyone else from doing so. In short, it isn't just dangerous to Jews, it's also dangerous to our shared goal of racial equality. And I don't think I have time for questions, but if Steve disagrees, I'm happy to take some.
First of all, thank you so much. Really, thank you so much. And next time, don't tell us what you really think. But I was going to ask, I think there's a lot of comments and certainly a lot of questions as well. But I think I would like to ask David Levitt, who's one of the co-chairs of our advisory board, if he could put one or two questions, and just ask for if our next speaker's patience just with me. But I think that we really ought to have at least one or two questions. David?
Thank you. There one question was, and it is related, which is the liberated ethnic studies curriculum in California, which of course is being pushed in other places too. And your thought not only about that, but what can be done about it?
On the first question, my thought about that, I don't know enough about it. I mean, I gather that it is pushing the same principles, the same tenets as the 1980s and 90s critical race theory and as the DEI movement and anti-racism today, in which case everything I just said applies to it. As to what we can do about it, I'm an academic, not a politician.
David, is there another question, follow-up question or another question?
No, that was the only question we had.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I guess everybody thought it was pellucid what you said, but I appreciate it very much and thank you so much. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce, as soon as I figure out how to do it. Oh, look at that. Is April, is this yours?
It is.
Oh my gosh. So April Powers, she's a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Project Shema. She's formerly the chief equity and inclusion officer for the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. In fact, she was the first one there. She was a highly rated trainer for Fortune 50 government and nonprofit organizations. She consulted at Amgen for many years, including project managing their cultural dexterity rollout and delivering certified training in the areas of generational diversity, communication, emotional intelligence, and cultural competence. April co-launched Jubian Princess to foster inclusion in Jewish spaces. And her topic, and she is a professional at trying to teach people not to be anti-Semitic. Her topic is the importance of including anti-Semitism training in DEI programs. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Resnikoff, and thank you all of you for being here today. And if you've made it this far, thank you for your patience and for continuing to be present. I want to say a couple of things before I get started. My presence on this panel is for diversity of opinion and thought. I don't necessarily agree with my fellow panelists, but I fully respect all of their research and their contributions to this work. I think little by little, we will get there. I am a diversity and inclusion professional. That's what I do. But last year I made international news because as a Black woman who is also Jewish, I'm a Black Jew, I was for the first time in my life, when Jews were being beaten on the streets of New York and Los Angeles and London, Paris, wherever else, because of a war that was happening with Israel and Hamas. And I realized that and ADL recognized this as well, that anti-Semitism was at its highest in my lifetime. For the first time in my entire DEI career, which started with me being the head of diversity and inclusion for Nestle USA, the largest food and beverage company in the world, for the first time in my life, I was putting out a public statement condemning anti-Semitism in all its forms. And when I went to the board with this, we had previously done a Black Lives Matter statement, a statement in support of trans youth and their families, a statement against anti-Asian hate when Asians were being beaten on the streets because the former president called it Kung Flu, and they were being blamed for a pandemic. That also came from a country that some of them may not vote in or live in. I had more pushback from the board this time. I was told that I had to include Israel in the statement, and I roundly denied that. I said, Jew hate predates Israel, so we are not going to do that. And I assume you hired me as the first equity and inclusion professional because you want my views on this. We ended up with a statement that was a little bit of an all lives mattering of the situation, which left a general statement at the bottom, which left it open to someone who had posted anti-Semitic rants previously. And my mistake, the one that I apologize for, is I didn't vet her. I didn't vet this person. And I said, and when she asked, does this statement include us, Palestinians and Muslims? I said, of course it does. And then there was a monomaniacal rant. She basically hijacked the statement, took it over to make it a pro-Palestinian statement, hashtag me pro-Palestine. But the reason that she was deleted and blocked ultimately was because she posted on a children's book website as a children's book author and as a DEI professional in Montessori schools, and now has a book deal for children's books, posted about slaughtering children, which fine, but we're a children's book website. When Jews on others also posted about Palestinians slaughtering children, they were deleted. The difference was she kept going. So I blocked and deleted her and became her oppressor. So we had a Black Jew oppressing a Palestinian Muslim, according to the woke powers that be, as we call them. For me, I was called a white supremacist Talmudic. I was told, you're not Black. You're in fact a white supremacist Talmudic Jew, CUN, expletive. And I received all kinds of threats. I had to shut down my Twitter that I'd had for many, many years. The FBI did get involved with some of this. And I went into a deep personal depression for about 9 months. I couldn't even speak on this. What I did do is I talked to a couple of outlets just to protect my colleagues and to protect the organization, because I didn't think that they should have had anything to do with it. In fact, in order to post the statement, I personally offered to be the person to comment so that if anything went wrong, I would leave the company, which is ultimately what ended up happening. And I couldn't talk about it. So I have just now started to talk about it in the last six months or so. I will tell you that none of the stories online have it perfectly 100% correct. And we don't have time today to tell all the different nuances of the story, but that's what it is. I am the great-granddaughter of Jews who fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. I'm also the great-granddaughter of formerly enslaved people who escaped chattel slavery through changes of laws only. I'm a synagogue board member. I'm also an inclusion strategist, and I believe that inclusion allows us to have these tough conversations in ways that are not always effective. But I will tell you that one of the grandmothers of diversity, equity, and inclusion was a Jewish woman. And I think, like her, I failed to adequately fold anti-Semitism into my DEI program. And one of the reasons that I signed on to Project Shema to do this work, Shema meaning to hear, to listen, to understand, is because I feel really strongly that we're not going to dismantle DEI programs at this point. But we can influence and impact those programs to be more equitable. If you read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, she focuses on 3 groups. She focuses on Jews, the Dalit, also once known as the Untouchables in India, and Black Americans, as having had the worst treatment in the history of mankind, modern history of mankind, and maybe ever, right? That we have these huge numbers that meet that out. And so if someone like Isabel Wilkerson, who's focused on DEI, can call in Jewish people into this work, which I think we should all be reading that book, then we need to understand that there are ways to do DEI that are perhaps more inclusive and factual and real, and call Jews in instead of calling us out. So what do I do? I'm going to give you a little slice of my agenda and let you know what I offer to these DEI programs and what the agenda looks like, just so you know. I talk about why anti-Semitism and diversity, equity, inclusion. We explore identity. Most people don't understand who the Jew is, right? So then they don't understand why everything that they're doing in some of these programs are so anti-Semitic. And then we explain anti-Semitism. We see it in action, what it looks like. And I'm going to share some of these slides with you all today, how to spot it and how to be an ally. And then we have time for Q&A. The most important thing that I want you to know is that we approach at Project Shema, although we see anti-Semitism on the left and the right, and we're talking about the US, we are talking to folks that see themselves as progressive more, and we're using more progressive language because those are the folks that we touch. I encourage you to speak to the folks that you touch, because folks on the right are really happy to call out anti-Semitism on the left, and folks on the left are really happy to call out anti-Semitism on the right. White presenting Jews are happy to call out Blacks who are anti-Semitic, and those of us who identify as multi-ethnic Jews are stuck in this really interesting space where our heroes are saying these horrible things, and you're asking us to go talk to them, but sometimes may not include us in your planning. So one of the couple of asks before I ask for anything else, I'm going to ask that you consider unchecking your white box. Check that other box. Put your kippot back on. Wear your Star of David, if it's safe for you to do so. People need to know that they love Jews too, that there are people, because many of us hide at work. That is one of the things I will tell you as a DEI professional. Many Jews hide at work, and I am trying to encourage every single corporation that I get in touch with to allow for Jewish ERGs, for people to feel a sense of psychological safety and inclusion and belonging at work. It's not about equity for Jews, like I believe was mentioned earlier. We do have I think it was Dr. Sherry mentioned, we do have overrepresentation in certain fields and not in others, but we also can't just say that Blacks and other minorities or marginalized people, I wouldn't say minority, I'd say global majority, haven't been impacted by science in ways where maybe you're only, and women also, right? If you're only studying middle-aged white men for a study, you're not going to get everything. We're doing better with that. My husband was in clinical research. They're getting better at that. But a lot of prior clinical studies, measure men of a certain weight. I'm 5'1", it doesn't work, right? So what we try to teach is that anti-Semitism impacts every community because it's built on lies. And when facts and truth are undermined, democracy and civil rights are threatened, which means that all marginalized communities can be harmed. We can't always reference the Holocaust, but sometimes we do. And we know, and I invite you all to read Eric K. Ward's Skin in the Game article. He's a Black civil rights activist. He's not Jewish, but he writes about why you must combat anti-Semitism in order to attack and limit white nationalism and white supremacy and all racism. So we are the canary in the coal mine, as someone mentioned earlier. We are the world's oldest hate that fuels other bigotries and teaches other and teaches people how to hate and how to manipulate this. We talk about the spirit of DEI and how to make sure all employees feel included. If you exclude Jews in DEI, then you are dismissing the global lived reality of Jews and the intergenerational trauma that we all have. And I speak about my own intergenerational trauma, where I cannot, if I don't have my passport up to date, I really start to panic. And that's true for anyone in my family. Multiple times a year, I'm looking for places I can move to internationally. And my mother will not put a mezuzah on her door. So we also talk about all the stereotypes about Jews, and the challenge that it creates is that if you have Jews that work for you and we do feel alienated and erased, then you're not going to get the best work product from us, right? It's the same as any other marginalized group. And I think what's happened with Kanye this week is that some people are waking up to this fact. And I am going after this with a vengeance. This is my passion project. Here's an example of what we say. If you consider Jews to be a white religious community, it doesn't represent the 20% of American Jews who looked like me, the vast majority of the Jews in Israel and elsewhere that would not be considered white here in this country. And if you think of it as a religious bigotry, no one cares that we pray to the Torah. It's simply not accurate. Right? It's a Jew hate. It's an ethnicity. We're a people. We're a nation. We have language and heritage that's thousands of years longer and older than Jewish history, than Judaism. Some of us follow Judaism and some of us are atheists. Some of us are Buddhists. So it really isn't about how we pray. Somebody wearing a kippah, it's obvious that person is Jewish. If we're in a synagogue, that's a container for Jews. I would also add that Israel is a container for Jews, right? And so our global search for safety has left us all looking very different. And we talk about modern anti-Semitism from, basically from 70 CE, and we go through Jewish history so that people understand that most people think it's about religion. It's really about people, and we're attacked for being Jews, and it's anti-Jew and Jew hate, and it's not anti-Judaism. We also go into the fact that anti-Semitism itself is a made-up word by anti-Semites to try and figure out how to discern, people who look maybe like Dr. Reznikov from the Germans or Eastern Europeans living in that land, right? I don't know that they were expecting anyone who looks like me. But here's what I'm going to tell you, everyone who identifies as Jewish on this panel. I will tell you what it is that my grandparents, may their memories are a blessing to me, but a blessed memory. They don't have a single considered white presenting great-grandchild. They have LGBTQ, they have neuroatypical, we have disabled family. That's coming for you. If you have children or nieces or nephews or nibblings. So we have to, as Jews, show up and continue to show up in these spaces with our values. The number one Jewish value, tikkun olam, is caring for the world. It's more important than any religious value, right? It's showing up for social justice. And so I do encourage you to uncheck that white box, because white supremacy will never see you as white. They never will. And I encourage you to center the voices of Black Jewish women and marginalized Jews to combat anti-Semitism, so that people who think of us as a white supremacist community can see actually who we are and what the makeup is and who we are going to be. And this is my favorite slide as a DEI professional. We, in the US, it's really hard for us to look at anything. I think Dr. Sherry had mentioned this earlier. It's just we have this really specific lens on how we view oppression in the world. And so we address this. We address it through this racist lens of the most privileged being whites on top, Blacks on the bottom. And over time, Blacks are doing a little bit better than they have been in the past. But, and if you're looking at other countries, we may consider this to be caste or class, or, you can do male, female, different religions, right? But you never expect the people on the bottom to be on the top. And we see that some Jews, I will tell you that our socioeconomic status is pretty on par with the rest of the US, but of course, that's a conspiracy theory that nobody wants to address either. That you see Jews rising in, being able to be in upper echelons in society, to be on the Supreme Court, to be in leadership positions, right? And so if there is systemic oppression, then how does this happen? How do you get this group to be at the top? And what we have to understand is civil rights for Jews, I think somebody mentioned, is only 200 years old. This is a unique situation in our entire history. But yes, if you had looked at Jews maybe 100 years ago, 1922 Germany, you may have seen some of us in government and arts and elsewhere. And the reason that we teach that anti-Semitism works completely differently to DEI professionals is that only 20 years later, we were being, taken on cattle cars, forced to dig our own mass graves, and we lost, 6 million of us in one fell swoop. We have not recouped those numbers. And though yes, today, some of us may be here. There are also still many of us here. We still have homeless and impoverished Jews in our factions. We look back at our history for thousands and thousands of years and know, like our grandparents or parents tell us, it's only a matter of time, although we might seem hyperbolic when we say it. And we teach this to DEI professionals, and many of them have taken this on and looked at it. We also explain how we've been demonized, right? And that we have been called to be our oppressor. That Zionism as racism is such an easy thing to say and a very hard thing to unpack. We unpack Zionism and what it is. And again, we are talking in these progressive spaces because we know that whether you're on the right or the left, we are still being demonized. We're seeing Holocaust trivialization, and we're teaching people how this works. And how it works is what happened to me. When I was called out and told I shouldn't be in DEI, I should never have been someone with progressive values. I had been called out because I put in some article somewhere, Israel and India are my two favorite countries, and they still are, as evidence of why I should not be an inclusion professional. Jews get cleaved from good society. And many of us are fleeing from those spaces because there might be an anti-Semite in a women's march or an anti-Semitic, trope in some of, or request in some of the things that we're receiving. And then we go to the other side and we become one issue Jews. We can't afford that either. And I'm going to tell you what my business partner, Jubian Princess, told me. She said, get back in there, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and then they can say that the Jews never show up. And whether it's on the right, and we're seeing, people with tiki torches and dressed and nicely and suited and booted, as we say, in collared shirts with tiki torches, or marginalized people believing that we are in fact the devil or the reason that they are suffering, we are getting cleaved from society and asked to leave. And when we're not present, then people don't know who we are, and it's much easier to dismiss us. And oops, sorry, we got two of these. And then we end up alone in the world, right? So I'm going to just show you really quickly our allyship slide. We ask people to address anti-Semitism the way you would any other bigotry, avoid tokenization. And what does that mean? It means there's a very small percentage of Jews that don't believe Israel has the right to exist. Please don't listen to their voices or amplify their voices only when they're not representative. I don't represent all Black Jews. I don't represent all diversity and inclusion professionals, but certainly you wouldn't want to choose someone who vastly underrepresents a group to be the voice and center that for our community. I unfortunately had to All Lives Matter some of our attacks, we don't want Israel to be a reason that Jewish Americans are impacted. And we don't exclude Jewish organizations because they have a right. They believe Israel has a right to exist. We explain how very simple Zionism is. And we ask, and this is what I'm going to ask all of you, particularly if you work in an organization. Project Shema comes in and gives these talks. We have full day sessions for campus and university. We have talks for civic organizations, and we have talks for large organizations and companies. We are trying to slow down the ripple effect that is impacting our community from where we rest on the left. If you know people that you think that might help, please let me know. But what I will say, and I want to add a couple of things that, you know, here, I'm going to escape out of here so that you don't have to see that. Okay. One of the things I want to say, I would never have reported, if it didn't make the news, I would never have reported what happened to me. I couldn't even talk about it for several months. And so the numbers, if you hear that somebody's inflating the numbers, I doubt it. I doubt it. I bet those numbers are much higher. And if something happens to you, I don't care what it is, I hope you will report it, because the numbers are inaccurate. If you are invited to be part of a white affinity group, that is wrong. You know, as Dr. Albuchet, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his last name. No, we're not a part of a white affinity group. And all you have to say is white supremacy will never let me in that club. And oppressor is baked into DEI. Having an oppressor and an oppressed is baked into a DEI framework that I'm hoping to dismantle in certain ways. I think it's really not accurate to look at the United States of America, where people were enslaved for 400 years and not even included in scientific studies, and had their parents ripped away from them, drugs poured into their homes. Were allowed to have syphilis go through their entire bodies and say, there's not a system against you. But I also think it's inaccurate to say that a hate that has lasted thousands and thousands of years is also not systemic. And anti-Semitism is the oldest systemic hate there is in the world. And we have to fold that in appropriately into DEI. Like I said, I didn't do this appropriately. I did it more as a religious consideration. The grandmothers of DEI, Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe, if you want to Google them. Also, I don't know folded Jews or Judaism adequately into their DEI work, but I'm determined. This is what I meant to do, is to make sure that this happens going forward in any way that I can. And I can tell you right now, I've been in big companies and big rooms, and we're making changes one company at a time. So if I don't know if I have time for questions, I saw somebody say, how do you fight it when you put your job at risk? We're going to be putting our jobs at risk. I had to quit my job. I quit my job in the middle of it. I don't know if you can do that, but sometimes you have to, that's what sometimes has to be done, right? Like this is a revolution. This is for us too. We don't have time. Every single generation of us has had Jews that have had to fight this problem, and there have been Jews that have kicked back and stayed silent, and we can't be silent either. You need to be at the table, whatever that table is, whether you're on the right, the left, the middle, and you need to show up for Jews and show out as Jews and not use your sword as a shield. If you are a white presenting Jew, you can say, I'm a white presenting Jew, but white supremacy won't have me. So I'm checking the other box, and I've got my kippah on.
Okay, so let me ask a question, April, if that's okay. This is David Levitt. I'm one of the co-chairs of the advisory board for JLJS. Are you finding, and I'm going to tell you a little story first, but as part of it, that there's a difference. We heard Dr. Oldbooker's story, we heard Professor Sherry, and we had heard Ken Marcus. They're primarily dealing with what they see on campus as compared to what you are dealing with in corporate America. And I'll say this, in my law firm, which is almost over 100 years old, I was the second Jewish partner in its history. And that was a long time ago, 40 years ago, and there's been many since me. And it took me 10 years to finally include in our DEI program a Jewish employee resource group. And we are very much included in the DEI program at my firm, at least. Others might not. So my question then comes back to you, which is, are you finding that there is a difference in the corporate DEI experience, not necessarily what you personally went through in terms of that, although that's included in the question, as compared to what we're seeing on the campus DEI experience?
For the campus DEI experience, what is so tragic about the campus DEI experience is that you're talking about young people. I almost want to say children, but I don't want to offend anyone. You're talking about very young people who are very susceptible to the respect of their professors and the people that are teaching them, and also don't know how to defend themselves My goddaughter is one of those people. They passed BDS on her campus at Ohio State, or they were trying to, and then she was no longer felt comfortable going to Jewish events, wearing her Star of David. She was just, and now she's trying to move to LA. She's willing to give up everything in Ohio to move to Los Angeles, where she thinks she'll be safer, and is encouraging her sisters to do so. So there's going to be a brain drain for Ohio and a beauty drain. But so there are a couple things happening. DEI is not just part of the campus program, it's part of the educational program and the educational system. And so there's ethnic studies, right? And Dr. Sherry, they're trying to use words like Israel is a rogue state in our educational materials in California. They are trying to put anything they can to that is anti-Semitic in these materials and sneak them in. And luckily, we have some very brave people trying to get rid of those. But those are still going to be going into some of the campus work. So when we go on campus, we actually do 1 to 2 day full workshops for students, because we're trying to arm Jewish students with how to stop the spread. We call it the spread of anti-Semitism amongst the people that they know. I can't convince somebody that I'm not in relationship with to treat me as a human being. I'm a Black Jew. I have known this my entire life. Like, it is what it is, right? Like, there are going to be people who like me, people who don't, people who pull me aside and follow me around a store. My husband didn't believe it till he saw it. He was like, nobody knows who you are. It's just, we go in and we teach students first, because we believe that Jews in relationship with other people are the best resource. We have to activate and animate ourselves to combat this ourselves. And we don't have a lot of time for all this division, for us to decide who's a Jew, who's not a Jew, to make Jews of color and Jews of other feel unwelcome in our spaces, or that they don't belong. We are only 15 million people, and we have got to get it together.
Right, but what about your thoughts about the DEI programs in corporate or professional America?
What I'm saying is the programs at the universities are more embedded, because they're actually teaching classes around this. And I think those are going to be harder to impact, but we are talking to those universities to impact those programs. I think DEI programs and at corporate are going to be easier for us to talk to, because we can impact an entire organization. But we're working on both. I think DEI on campus, from what I'm seeing, is a lot harder. It's a lot harder to tackle.
But are you finding,
yes,
and I don't mean to beat a dead horse on this, but are you finding that corporate America is more open to
yes.
the ideas that you are asking for? Not necessarily, as Professor Sherry said, I'm not debating her point either, but not necessarily to dismantle their corporate DEI programs, but to include Jewish issues in their DEI program. Certainly my firm has done that. And to avoid the kind of demonization that is described, for example, by Dr. Olbach.
I think they're willing to start it. How willing they are to continue it, I don't know. But one of the things we're asking them to do is to start Jewish ERGs that are ethnic ERGs, not religious ones, and to pull them out of the religious bucket. One, because some of them don't fund religious ERGs, and two, because that creates more anti-Semitism if you don't understand who a Jew is. Exactly. So we are at the beginning. We consider these partnerships. We educate them, like when things like Kanye come out and some of these other things happen. We're asking people to sign on for the Shine a Light on anti-Semitism for the week of Hanukkah every year. But how deep they're going to go with that remains to be seen. We're only a couple years old as an organization, but we are getting deep penetration with companies and campuses through many of the Hillels. And I wish I could say I had numbers for you, because I love a number, David. I love studies and knowing where things end up, but I can say I'm more on the corporate DEI side. So I can say on the DEI side, though we have had some very interesting pushback, like all the tropes that you've heard, for reasons why we don't need help. but we push back, and we have a lot of marginalized Jews on a number of marginalized Jews on our team that push back from their intersectional identities, right? Like, this is who I am, and no, I wish I had the power to change the world, but it would be a really beautiful place if I did, but I actually personally don't. I mean, I'm joking, right? So how can you support us in Project Shema? Tell everybody you know about us. We are doing this work, especially in progressive spaces. If you'd like to donate, there's a donate button on the projectshema.org website, and you can mention that you saw this talk here today. But really, what I'm asking you, especially if you're white presenting Jews or have impact in your organizations, bring this talk in, learn more, I'm giving a free talk of the full talk on the full talk that I give with a little bit different next week. I can put the link to that in the chat, I think, if that's okay.
Fine.
So people can sign up. It's at a synagogue, so it's perhaps more of a Jewish audience. So if you're sharing, I would probably share that with the Jewish audience if you can. And it's going to take me. Do you have more questions as I'm looking for?
No, that was it. That was my question, actually. So I wanted to ask it, and I think I would say that it took me 10 years because I always was getting that the Jews are a religion, and I kept on saying no, we're a people. And finally, I got that message across, and they finally agreed to do it. But it took 10 years of work. So.
Right. And what we say in our presentation is simply, we don't tell anybody else how to identify, and nobody should tell a Jew how to identify.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that we say. So again, I'm trying to find this link because it's already on my calendar. But if you want to close out, I'll try to find it, and I will take my face off.
Go ahead and put it on the chat when you're ready. Is there any? I don't think we have any other questions right now for you, but I have a question for Professor Sherry. If you're still on, I see you, and if you can unmute. The question is, I mean, your presentation is so powerful. You have such a strong position. I assume that you started taking that position after you already had tenure, or I mean, if you had pushback within the university and in your profession.
Yes. I already had tenure. The first article I wrote with a colleague in the early 1990s. I think it was published in 1992. I'd been tenured for about 6 years at that point. We got all kinds of pushback. There was a whole symposium organized basically to demonize us. I was called a white male in print, as was another colleague of mine who didn't help write that article, but did some similar things, who happens to be a Chinese American. He was called a white male. And I have been, when I was given a chair at my first university, there were student protests. Some of them were organized by one of my colleagues at that university. I've had a lot of pushback. I've been saying this now, as I said, the first article that I wrote with a colleague about the anti-Semitic implications of critical race theory, essentially, that article came out around 1992, and then we turned that article and 2 others into a book that we published in 1997 called the Radical Assault on Truth in America, Beyond All Reason, the Radical Assault on Truth in American Law. And so I've been doing this for a long time. I'm glad I'm retired now, because if I weren't, I'd probably be canceled.
Do you find that there are any people in the DEI community, not the mainstream of it necessarily, who are at least open to the message of changing what it means? That's I think what's happening at my firm, at least. Maybe I'm not, who knows, but that it's not all about CRT and woke, but it's about fairness and yes, about racism too. But are you finding any part of that community is at least open to discussion and dialogue, as opposed to the certainty in their own positions?
I don't interact with them that much. And so I don't know. I mean, I won't say categorically that nobody is interested. Clearly, April is interested, right? And she's found other people who are interested in open. Certainly, the academic institutions with which I have been affiliated have not been very open about, and with which my children have been affiliated. They have told stories of anti-Semitism on their campuses as students, do not appear to be open to that sort of thing.
Ken, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Sure. So I want to thank Susanna Sherry for her presentation. I don't think I've ever gotten more pleasure from a lecture that began with the words, "I want to disagree with Ken Marcus." I think she may have perfected that genre. In my talk, I began by distinguishing between DEI as a movement versus DEI as the whole apparatus of anti-discrimination, diversity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I tried to convey is that I think that the latter can be fixed. In your talk, I took it that you were saying that the former can't be fixed. So I'm not entirely sure that we disagree, unless I missed something, and that your notion was that you're opposed not only to the more contemporary movement that you criticize, but also the entire project of fighting discrimination and working on inclusivity within corporate and other institutional settings.
I'm not opposed to it, but I think it's been so hijacked that it's by the DEI movement and the woke movement and all of that, at least within universities, that there's no going back. I mean, I've been in this business now for 40 years, and I've seen the sort of development from we have to end discrimination. There is still a lot of discrimination, which there was, and we have to find a way to do it, to the sort of every white is a racist. We have to, or every white is privileged. I mean, it used to be there are some bad people here. There is discrimination. There are some disparities. We need to fix the disparities. And it has just, I think hijacked is the right word. I agree with you that some of the earlier iterations were necessary and helpful, but I don't think we can ever get them back. And I say that basically from being inside of academia. Every day I would get an email that some new DEI professional was being hired, or there was some new DEI training being offered or required. And so I don't see how we can go back to what it used to be, which I agree, either could be fixed or didn't need fixing.
Thank you.
So if I could take a moment. I have, if all the questions, once the questions are answered.
I have an answer. Robert Milner has asked a question that I really want to answer.
Robert Milner, by the way, is one of the members of our advisory board, so please.
So, he's asking actually Ken Marcus, but Ken, you're welcome to chime in. How will a likely ruling by the Supreme Court abolishing affirmative action in college admissions impact DEI on campus? It won't. Those people are entrenched. They are not leaving. It also will, a ruling by the Supreme Court is not going to change affirmative action or get rid of it in the slightest. The Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court says, as most people expect it to, that universities can't take race into account when they admit students, universities can get around that. They will all make SATs and ACTs optional And that will divide their applicants into two pools: the pool of people who submit their ACT or SAT scores, and they will all be high scoring, and they will be almost exclusively white or Asian. And then there will be the pool of people who don't submit their scores, either because they took the test and did poorly, or because they didn't take the test because they feared they would do poorly. That group will be mixed. There'll be whites, there'll be blacks, there'll be Hispanics, there'll be everybody in that group. From the first group, from the test-taking pool, the universities will use the same criteria they've always used: high scores, teacher recommendations, high grades, and so on. From the non-test-taking pool, there will be no objective measures. And so they will use things like drive to succeed, commitment to make the world a better place, ability to overcome obstacles. And then when they choose from that pool, there will be no way to demonstrate that they are actually taking race into account, that they are favoring one race over another. And they will end up, within a year or two, they will end up with the exact same racial proportions as they have now under affirmative action. So if you're counting on the Supreme Court to end affirmative action at universities, don't hold your breath.
So I think that I agree with the general thrust of that, but maybe not in quite such a marvelously unqualified and forceful way as what Susanna Sherry has articulated. Let's start with that there are lots of different kinds of post-secondary institutions, most of which are not selective. And so it doesn't necessarily apply to them. Then there are institutions that are lightly selective, and they might respond differently than those that are highly selective. And I think most of the conversation about this goes to the highly selective institutions. I think that there will be a change, although that's not different than what Professor Sherry has suggested. I think that the change will involve different methods by which the universities will try to get where they want to go without getting successfully sued. So there will be maneuvers like what she just said. Now, if you look at the ways in which institutions at California, Washington, Michigan, and other states reacted to state level prohibitions on racial preferences, you'll see that they did tend to change what they were doing, but they changed it to various extents. There appears to be at various institutions what one might call cheating, which is to say attempts to circumvent the rules with the sorts of thing that Professor Sherry suggested. In some institutions, there appears to have been at least enough compliance that it altered the composition of the student body. So I wouldn't say that there's going to be a no change, but I do think that there will be circumventions, and that those circumventions will lead to additional litigation. I think that some of those circumventions will rely on apparently facially neutral, race neutral approaches for explicitly race conscious reasons. And that those will probably be used in a number of institutions, challenged in court, and then defeated. So I think that there will be multiple cases following on, and then lots of different directions being used. And there are also, some institutions that are not as wedded to the current progressive ideology as others. I think overwhelmingly, the highly selective institutions are as Professor Sherry described, but there are also other institutions that will go in a different direction.
There are a number of other questions, but I guess we're running a little bit at a time. We can take another one or two. Ken, if you look in the chat, you'll see that they're identified as for you.
Sorry to hear that. Well, I don't know. Did you want to choose
okay.
one?
I think he actually answered the question, and April April was asked a question about numbers by another one of our board members, and she answered it in the chat as well.
But it's not validated. These are numbers that I've just about the internet. So if anybody has those validated numbers, that would be great. I can't turn my camera on for some reason, but.
Oh,
but I think the larger point is, and the one I try and make, at least when I do it, is that Jews are a multicultural, multi-ethnic group. We are not all white. We are, Mizrahi and Jews of color and Sephardi and every other Ethiopian and everything else, and that we have something in common, but we're not just white. And that's kind of the point that you've been making, I think, April. And so I think what Mark was looking for was something to be able to say it rather than just do it off the cuff, so to speak. But I think it's pretty clear that that's true.
Okay, so I'm going to assert the prerogative of chair and have some few concluding remarks, and want to thank everybody for their participation. First, I think it's interesting to note that we had a diverse perspectives. Different panel members, we had different topics about diversity. Some people thought that there's optimistic that maybe we should there should be work done within DEI programs to improve them. In fact, everybody, I think, thought that there ought to be improvements if the DEI programs are going to continue. Others thought that the DEI programs are going to continue, but they were less hopeful about whether there would be positive changes with respect to anti-Semitism. We saw details about the problem at Stanford University, at an elite university. We saw that sometimes the whole notion of a DEI program can be counterproductive. I'm just going to mention Frank Dobbin, the chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University, and the Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences, co-author of Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't. He published in 2022. He points out that some of the diversity programs, and you're not talking about anti-Semitism, but some of the diversity programs, because of the mandate that people participate, that actually exacerbates sometimes the anti-Semitism, not the anti-Semitism, the racism and the bigotry that are in people, because they resent being forced to participate in these types of programs. So we have people working on trying to change programs, trying to introduce people to the modern notions of anti-Semitism, the new anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that's camouflaged as anti-Zionism. This program wasn't obviously intended to try to provide answers. We picked this topic because we thought that it was a very important topic, especially as DEI programs are proliferating and becoming more and more filled with resources, that it's important that study be done of them, that we think about how it can be improved, that we realize that there's a problem. And I imagine that most of you in the audience know people who are oblivious to the problem. We know people who aren't, but we probably know people who are very oblivious to the problem. And it's a time to wake them up. Hopefully we'll share this recording, and maybe you could share the recording with them. Again, I don't know I know a lot of people have mentioned in the chat that they thought this was a wonderful program. It was an unusual program, extraordinary. I think that our center is unusual. It's unusual at a college center or the College of Law Center to have at a College of Law to have a center that will be able to provide this kind of programming. And we hope it'll precipitate continued study about this topic and others like it. I want to remind you that this was a free undertaking, free for you, but we do really encourage you. We hope that you'll consider favorably making a contribution to our scholarship fund to help bring in some students who can assist us in our programming. And with that, I'm going to wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.